Welcome to the ultimate guide to postmodernism. This will be a multi-part series, and you want to make sure that you stick around for all the other parts, because this is not just going to be a bog standard explanation of postmodernism that you can hear anywhere online. This is a revolutionary, life-changing teaching that's going to open a doorway to meta-rationality and higher stages of cognitive development, construct-aware, and beyond. If you don't know what all that word salad means, don't worry about it. Just the key here is that this is guiding you, leading you towards something. We're really only going to be using postmodernism as an entryway into higher levels of cognitive development that can be reached. So that's why we're doing this whole thing, right? But of course, I'm also going to offer you all the bog standard explanations. And in fact, here you're going to get one of the clearest, starkest, deepest explanations of postmodernism that you'll hear anywhere online. Now, the term postmodernism, you hear this thrown around online quite a bit, especially in politics these days. It's actually been turned into what's called one of these thought-terminating cliches. It's used as a smear by right-wingers and conservatives, even by liberals. It's been turned into this confused abstraction, and it's worse than useless in the way that these people use this term. So this is part of the thing that we're going to be clearing up, but of course we're going to be going much, much deeper than just that. So we're going to talk about in this series, what is postmodernism, how to distinguish it from other kinds of worldviews, where it goes right, where it goes wrong, and how it is misunderstood. And we're going to be focusing on the core existential insights and sense-making that are inherent to postmodernism. We're going to help you to understand what the good in it is and how you can actually apply it in your life for deepening your understanding of reality as part of this endeavor of sense-making that we're doing with this work, if you're following my work. And, in life, in the end, what is the point of all these different kind of philosophies like postmodernism or its alternatives? It's just a sense-making apparatus. It's a sense-making attitude, you might say. And then, of course, the question comes up, well, which is the right sense-making attitude? And to answer that question, that's a really, really difficult thing. That's a lot harder than just explaining what postmodernism is, because you can just read a bog standard dictionary definition or a, Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy definition of postmodernism, but that's not going to really help you to make sense of reality and to move forward and to actually get traction with your understanding of what the hell is going on. Because they'll give you a kind of a bog standard explanation, but then they won't tell you where the serious flaws of it are. That's what we're going to focus on. But this episode and this whole series is not going to be political. I don't care about politics here. What I care about is a deep understanding of philosophy and sense-making. So be careful if you're coming at this subject from a left-wing or right-wing political position, you're already on the wrong track. You need to be able to think about these issues at a much more fundamental level so that your political biases don't skew your understanding of things. There are many straw-man versions of postmodernism out there from conservatives and even from liberal types. And that's because, honestly, postmodernism is pretty radical and it's difficult to understand. Most people in society, even people in universities and academia, don't truly understand postmodernism. And then some who do, they corrupt it with their political activity and they confuse postmodernism with political activism, which is a huge mistake, which we'll be talking about as we get into the limits of postmodernism later on here. So there's a lot of confusion about this subject that we're going to be clearing up. This episode will cut through all that BS. Now, about me, I'm not a postmodernist. I'm beyond a postmodernist. And what is beyond postmodernism? We'll get to that too. Because once you identify the limits of postmodernism, then something new will open up, which is meta-rationality and stuff in that direction. But even though I'm not a postmodernist, in this episode, my job is to present the most steel-manned version of postmodernism, because it's very easy to straw-man postmodernism. You can find all sorts of silly examples of relativism and various contradictions within postmodernism, yeah, you can do that. You can make fun of it, which is usually what conservatives do, but it doesn't get you it doesn't really do anything for you in your life. You still just stay stuck at your current levels of cognitive development, which are not very high for most conservatives. So first in this series, I'm going to offer you a sort of a traditional explanation of postmodernism, the bog standard stuff. But then really where the juice is, the value of this whole talk, is in the second half, where we're going to get into my advanced understandings of postmodernism. I'm going to be sharing insights about postmodernism with you that even postmodernists don't understand. These are many fresh, profound, life-changing insights that I've developed on my own, stuff that you're not going to hear anywhere else. And that's really the value. And we're going to explore every trap of postmodernism, which they fall into. See, those who reject postmodernism fall into a certain set of traps. We'll talk about all those. And then those who accept postmodernism, they fall into a different set of traps. And we'll, of course, explain all of those. And the purpose of all this is to get you to spiral dynamics tier 2, construct awareness, meta-rationality. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. I'll have future episodes that explain it. I also have previous episodes. You can search for Spiral Dynamics, my Spiral Dynamics series, which explains that kind of stuff. And if you ultimately integrate all of the insights that I'll be sharing with you over the next few episodes in this series, you will be in the top 0.5% of human minds in terms of cognitive development, because this stuff is simply not understood. Even academics don't really have a solid handle on the things that we're about to say. But with that intro out of the way, let's get into the meat of the subject. So we're going to take a sort of a bit of a roundabout way to get to a definition of postmodernism, which is that first we're going to consider its alternatives. We're going to create a three-part distinction here. To understand what postmodernism is, first you have to understand what premodernism is and what modernism is. And so the distinction is going to be between those three concepts: the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern. Let's begin by defining modernism. I'm going to be giving you lists here, many, many lists of features of these worldviews and attitudes. But what I want you to keep in mind is that these lists are going to be very comprehensive and detailed, and almost no human being in the real world is going to neatly fit into any of these categories. In reality, the human mind is a very messy thing, and nobody is born a modernist or a pre-modernist or a postmodernist, and nobody leaves university as one of those either. In reality, it's a messy jungle in your mind for most people, even though you're going to be gravitating towards one or the other of these various, we might say, epistemic attitudes, sense-making attitudes. That's really what we're talking about. And then there's different ways of approaching how you make sense of reality. Okay, so what is modernism? First and foremost, modernism says that there is an objective reality that can be known. It also says that the right approach to understanding this objective reality is through systematic rational study. And if you do that kind of study, then you'll understand how reality actually is. Modernism is a belief in universal truths and grand narratives. It's an embrace of overarching explanations of reality and history. So when you read a history book, a high quality, scientific-like history book, you're getting the real history of the world, of Western civilization, or some such. That's what modernism tells us. Modernism is a sort of epistemological realism. There exist objects independent of the mind. What do you think? Is that true or is that false? Or maybe a better question is, how true is that? That there exist objects independent of the mind? And if there do, how do you know that? Do you know that using your mind? You see how tricky this gets? It's not so easy, because when you say, yeah, of course, Leo, there's objects independent of the mind. But even to say that, you see, even with a little bit of self-reflection, you can see that just to say that already is you doing that with your mind. And also, you have to wonder, did you explore all the objects in the universe to know that they're all independent of your mind? Or you might say, well, only some of them are. Okay, but how do you know which ones are and which ones aren't? After all, each object you explore, that you want to claim is independent of your mind, you're exploring it with your mind. So that's a little bit of a problem for modernism, but we'll get to that later. Modernism is a correspondence theory of truth, which means that what is truth? Truth is there's a world out there, and then there's my mind. And my mind can have mental images and maps of the world out there. And depending on how good my maps and images are, we can compare them to the world out there and see whether my mind is accurately reflecting the truth that is out there. So this is the correspondence theory of truth. This is kind of bog standard stuff. This is how most people think of truth and reality. You could also say that modernism is this notion, this overused statement of facts don't care about your feelings, which of course comes from this sort of a attitude of rationalism. Reason and scientific method lead to the truth. That's what modernism says. And scientific method and rationality are universal and total. They are our best way of understanding what's true. Nothing better has ever been found than scientific method and rationality. Every other method of trying to understand reality is inferior and leads to all sorts of gross self-deceptions and wishful thinking and superstitious, mystical, religious, dogmatic forms of knowledge. Modernism says that some forms of knowledge are superior to others. For example, science is superior to religion and to mysticism. Modernism is the paradigm of rationality, science, objectivity, and empiricism as opposed to religion, tradition, dogma, faith, superstition, conformity, tribalism, stuff like medieval scholasticism, and idle armchair metaphysical speculation and thinking. Modernism came around with the Renaissance, especially the scientific revolution, what's called the European Enlightenment. So we're not talking about spiritual enlightenment, we're just talking about European Enlightenment here, and the Industrial Revolution. So really, modernism arose as an attitude, as a sort of a cohesive attitude, starting in the 1600s, really took off in the 1700s and beyond. That's what we call the modern era. And this, of course, is where the term Enlightenment values. Have you heard that, Enlightenment values? So that's coming in the 17th and 18th centuries. Modernism is the idea that universal principles apply across cultures. There are certain universal human values and rights, independent of culture. Doesn't matter if it's some natives living in the Amazon or it's Western Europeans. For example, scientific method isn't just something that Western Europeans consider as superior. It's something that is superior regardless of where you are and what culture you're at. It's not a cultural thing. Scientific method works in the Amazon jungles and in the tribes of Africa. Scientific method still works, whether they know it or not. And rationality still works wherever you are on the globe. Modernism is the notion that you can look at reality objectively, free from bias of culture and language. Now, of course, sure, modernists will admit that our culture has some bias to it, of course, but we can sort of step beyond that. And this is the scientific ideal, is stepping beyond and doing science in a way that applies cross-culturally. So when a scientist discovers some truth about astrophysics or about Earth geology or about evolution, that scientist wants to say that's not just true from American culture's point of view or from the point of view of Western culture. It's true for all cultures and all times. It's not just true now in the 21st century. It will be true in the 22nd century, and it was true 2 centuries ago. Modernism is also formalism, quantification, and reductionism. There's a lot that we can go into there that I probably won't elaborate on here. Those could have a whole episode just on them. And I've done a series called Deconstructing the Myth of Science, Part 1, 2, 3, where I go in depth about the foundations of science, where we talk about some of that kind of stuff and its limits. So I won't belabor that point here, but just take note. In general, I would say that modernism takes language for granted in scientific work. It assumes that language can accurately represent reality and doesn't present us with intractable problems for understanding the nature of reality. You could say that modernism, in a sense, is a search for ultimate meaning or ultimate truth, although some modernists might deny that ultimate meaning exists, but many generally buy into that idea. And maybe that meaning is just, evolution or technological advancement or something like just human flourishing and happiness or the liberation of mankind to have, universal human rights. These could be the kind of meanings that are being meant. Or maybe the meaning is scientific understanding of the universe. Maybe it's something like that. Or technological mastery over nature. Modernism is fundamentally a faith in human capacity to understand and control nature. Technological mastery over nature. It holds that human society is progressing gradually towards improvement. Not always is each decade better than the previous one, but generally that's the trend. That's what a modernist would tell you. Modernism emphasizes order, hierarchy, and structure. Modernism gives us the rise of atheism, secular humanism, and liberal democracy. These are some of the core Enlightenment values: the separation of church and state, and secular society. So one way to distinguish whether someone is a modernist or not is just ask them, do you believe in church and state and that society should be secular? And if they tell you no, then they're not a modernist. Of course, there's multiple alternatives to modernism, but you know that then they're not a modernist. Modernism is classic liberalism and also neoliberalism. Individualism, freedom, free speech, universal human rights, individual autonomy. It's a very individualistic worldview. That's what came about with the European Enlightenment. It champions meritocracy over things like nepotism and affirmative action. Society should be hierarchical, and the hierarchy of society should be based on merit. How competent are you? So, before modernism, many of these positions, hierarchy existed before modernism, of course, even more so, but many of these positions in these hierarchies were occupied simply through nepotism because your father had the position, or your family, or your bloodline, or your clan, or your tribe. It wasn't like you were the most qualified, you were the best connected. You were related to the right people. And that's why you got that plum position in some hierarchy. Modernism has a morality that is grounded in objective reason. Think of Kantian morality, and also Sam Harris's objective moralism. Sam Harris tries to define a sort of an objective morality based on secular human values and reason, and he claims that this is a legitimate pursuit and not just sophistry. Modernism is identifiable standards for aesthetics and beauty. So beauty is not just in the eye of the beholder. There's certain standards, objective standards to beauty and aesthetics. Modernism is logical positivism, Marxism, communism, the U.S. founding fathers and Constitution, capitalism, early feminism, first wave feminism, libertarianism, Ayn Rand's objectivism, behaviorism. These are some of the movements from Western intellectual tradition that fall under the umbrella of modernism. Now, there's a little bit of a tricky point here. when it comes to Marxism and communism, because when the right-wingers talk about postmodernism, they conflate it with Marxism and communism. So it might seem like, well, wait a minute, Leo, Marxism and communism, that's postmodern. That's not modern. That's actually wrong. And I'll explain why that is when we get to talking about postmodernism. But this is actually a tricky topic because in practice, many postmodernists do end up adopting and are sympathetic to forms of Marxism and socialism. But we have to be very careful not to conflate these two as we make our definitions, right? Because again, like I said, there's a difference between what these epistemic attitudes or sense-making schemes, what they are in their idealized forms versus how they're implemented in the real world. There can be a big disconnect between those two. In the same way that there can be a big disconnect between a conservative and their policies. Many conservatives, quote unquote conservatives, have policies that are not so conservative. And it's the same thing with liberals too, right? So it's very easy to be hypocritical about these sorts of schemes because the human mind is mostly interested in just raw opportunistic survival. It's not interested in being, puritanical about any one of these kinds of abstract philosophical schemes. These are highly, highly academic ways of thinking about reality, right? Most human beings are not thinking about reality in these very clear-cut categories. So just be careful with that. Some thinkers from the modernist tradition are Descartes, Hume, Kant, Locke, Newton, Darwin, Marx, Freud, Einstein. So if you're familiar with any of their works or core tenets and philosophies, that's mostly modernism. All right, now let's define what the pre-modern is. What happened, what was the attitude before the modern era, the Enlightenment came along? Well, it was the pre-modern era. This was mostly religious fundamentalism. Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, creationism, medieval philosophy, spiral dynamic stages, blue, red, and purple. If you don't know what that means, go see my series on spiral dynamics. Search for that on YouTube. It was animistic, pre-scientific. This was before rigorous science existed, before universities existed. It was traditional values and absolute divine morality. Morality was dictated down to man from God. It wasn't based on secular reasoning the way Sam Harris does it. It was absolute divine dictates from God, the Ten Commandments, and so forth. The pre-modern placed an emphasis on tradition and religious authority. The authority was not based on empirical science or pure reason. It was based on religious tradition. What the Pope tells you is what's true. You don't go testing the Pope's dictates with empirical method. You just believe the Pope or the divinely anointed monarch of your society. That's premodernism. Premodernism is a belief in rigid social hierarchies, even more hierarchical and rigid than modernism, and the belief that they're natural and divinely ordained. So this hierarchy is not based on merit. It's based on God's commands and religious scriptures and so forth. The king is not just a tyrant under this attitude. The king is appointed by God. That's a little bit weird for us people because most of us who are alive kind of fall into the modern or beyond frame of mind. So it's a little bit hard for us to understand, how could anyone have believed that a king wasn't just a tyrant, but that he was really, literally appointed by God? You see, that's a very different worldview. Imagine thinking of the president as appointed by God. You'd think twice about overthrowing him or voting against him, huh? Well, you wouldn't be able to vote, but you get my drift. The pre-modern is the belief in mystical and the supernatural, and the use of such explanations to make sense of reality. It's also the use of mythological explanations, the use of myth and legend to explain natural phenomenon and human origins. So if you ask a pre-modernist, where did man come from? It's not just going to be some evolutionary materialistic explanation of how we came about from, microbes in the early oceans billions of years ago. It's going to be the story of Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark. And these are often going to be taken literally as the origin of man, the Garden of Eden, and so on. And every culture has its own mythological origin stories. But the pre-modern takes these seriously, whereas the modern looks back at that and says, oh, well, that's just kind of like childish superstition. They didn't know any better. But you have to be careful, because as you're judging these different sense-making attitudes, you're going to be judging it from your own vantage point. And your vantage point is going to be either a modern one, a postmodern one, maybe a pre-modern one. So depending where your stance is, as you're hearing this information, you're going to be judging all the other paradigms that I'm talking about from your paradigm. This is going to skew your understanding. So you have to really be able to step back and evaluate and kind of like live and look through the eyes of each paradigm on its own merits without comparing it relative to your paradigm. So one of the mistakes here in trying to understand the pre-modern is that you're looking at the pre-modern through the lens of the modern or the postmodern, and then you're not understanding it. You're not understanding its significance and how people actually who hold it, how they see the world. You're not getting that. The pre-modern has a strong emphasis on communal identity. It's not about individualism. It's about community and tribe and clan and collective identity. That is more important, because you can't survive unless your clan survives under that paradigm. It also emphasizes oral tradition, a reliance on oral transmission of knowledge and wisdom, because a lot of these arose during times when there wasn't even writing invented yet. It also comes with many ritualistic practices, the importance of ritual in daily life and social function to keep society together, but also to keep the individual mind sane and orderly, so that people don't have mental illness and people don't become criminals. That's why we have these ritual practices, to keep the mind grounded. The pre-modern has limited geographical awareness, because the worldview is often limited to immediate surroundings and known culture and territory. Usually, the pre-modern represents a single culture, because during the pre-modern times, we couldn't travel very far. Most people during that time didn't interact with many cultures. It's not cosmopolitan. And so it didn't face the burden of trying to understand other cultures. Of course, that's a bit of an oversimplification. In the Roman Republic era, of course, there was a lot of trade between different kinds of cultures. There was the Silk Road, and there was trade with Arabia and so forth. But in general, the world was much less multicultural and cosmopolitan back then. It's pre-industrial, it's tribal. Nepotism takes place. Nepotism status and caste take place over meritocracy. Examples of the pre-modern include ancient Greek mythology, medieval Europe, feudalism, the Hindu caste system, monarchy, theocracy, Confucianism, Ayurvedic medicine, alchemy, and Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism as it is today is not entirely pre-modern, but it certainly borrows a lot and harkens back to the pre-modern. Okay, so now we have the modern, pre-modern distinction. Now let's create the postmodern distinction. And we'll begin with a quotation here from Richard Rorty, who's considered a postmodernist philosopher in the West. He says, quote, "After Darwin, it becomes very hard to say that human beings grasp the true nature of things. It's much easier to say that they developed language to enable them to serve various ends, better food, better sex, better shelter, more interesting lives, and so on, as opposed to doing this thing called knowing what things are in themselves. So, Don't ask the question, which language gets reality right? Just ask the question, which language serves what human purpose best? End quote. So, here's a list of features of the postmodern attitude. Postmodernism questions the core assumptions of modernism. Postmodernism is theory which breaks down the untenable dualities of modernism. What does that mean? We're going to get into that in a minute, so just hold on. I want to say a few other things first. Basically, well, let me say a few things now about it now, I guess, and then I'll say more about it as well as we go on. What are some of the dualities of modernism? Well, for example, rational versus irrational, or scientific versus unscientific, or mystical versus non-mystical. I have a whole series called Understanding Duality, Part 1, 2, 3, where I talk about hundreds of these dualities, and we break them down, and we see how they break down and collapse. So a lot of these dualities are sort of assumptions baked into our attitude. So the duality of like man versus nature, or the duality of man versus woman. A pre-modern person would say that man versus woman, this is just a given duality to us, is given down to us by God. A modern person might say it's just baked into the biology, which science tells us. And the postmodern person says, not so fast. We can no longer take these dualities for granted from these previous attitudes. Now we're going to be taking a very skeptical look at all these dualities and breaking them down where appropriate. Postmodernism is a skepticism towards grand narratives and doubt towards claims of objective truth and universal values. This notion of grand narrative is important. It's also sometimes called meta-narrative. What does this mean? A grand narrative or a meta-narrative means a single overarching explanation of reality. It is a totalizing system. So here's some examples of grand narratives and meta-narratives. Evolution, logical positivism, rationalism, liberalism, Christianity, Marxism, Freudianism, Nazism, or this notion of Western history. So let's say evolution. Let's take that as our example of a grand narrative. Why is it a grand narrative? Because evolution tries to make sense of all of reality using this singular lens of, natural selection, survival of the fittest, all that stuff you've heard many times. And you have this image in your mind of like, where did all of this come from? Why is all of this here? Well, it's because there were some bacteria 4 billion years ago that started to multiply and evolve through natural selection and random mutation and eventually turned into lizards, and those turned into dinosaurs, and those turned into mammals, and those turned into birds and monkeys and eventually humans. But evolution as a grand narrative doesn't just end there. It goes on beyond just the biological. Also, our technology is evolving. Society is evolving. Who knows where we're going to be in the next, 1,000 years? And also, we want to say the entire universe is evolving. The planet is evolving. Space and time are evolving from the Big Bang all the way to today. It's one giant evolutionary flow, you might say. And when somebody gets that kind of paradigm in their mind, they say, oh, okay, everything makes sense. Everything falls into place. It's all just evolution. That's the grand narrative. And that's what postmodernism wants to say. No, you can't say that. Because that's just one lens through which we can see reality, and there's other ways to look at it. And if you just confine yourself to that one lens, you're going to be limited. And it turns out that lens has certain biases to it, and really, who's to say which lens we should use to see reality through? Which meta-narrative is the right one? Consider Christianity. Christianity presents us with an alternative, pre-modern meta-narrative. The whole story of Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark and all that stuff, and Jesus Christ dying for your sins, and all the way to today, and you have to live according to the commandments and the Christian faith, And according to the Christian meta-narrative, the Christian meta-narrative is the one best, true, right narrative. It's not just a narrative, it is reality, according to that narrative. And everything else is wrong or inferior. And the only right way to live is by adopting that attitude, that meta-narrative, and treating it as absolute truth. So what's interesting with all these grand narratives, of course, is that they're very self-biased or self-serving, because each narrative says that it's the one true right one and the best one. See, evolution says it's true and best. Christianity says it's true and best. Islam says it's true and best. Judaism says it's true and best. Marxism says it's true and best. Science is also a meta-narrative, in a sense. Materialism, for example. The combination of materialism and rationalism constitutes most of modern science, and it says that it's best and truest. So which of these are you going to subscribe to? Which one of them actually is the true and best? Because they all claim to be. But of course, if they all claim to be, they can't all be. So the key insight of postmodernism is to realize that these are all just different paradigms. They're relative human constructions. All of these are human constructions, including Christianity, including science, including Marxism, and Western history. It's all a construction, and it's all a biased construction, and it's all just a particular way of looking at the world. And so that's illegitimate under postmodernism. So postmodernism can be defined as a suspicion of totalizing theories, resisting attempts to explain everything through a single theoretical framework. Instead of these grand narratives, which were popular in the pre-modern and modern era, postmodernism prefers a multiplicity of micro-narratives. Yes, you can explain bits and pieces of reality through various competing and alternative narratives, but these should be small, humble narratives rather than the large, grand, preposterous narratives such as Christianity or even science. So this is like the heart of postmodernism, but there's much more to it than just this. Postmodernism is a recognition that these meta-narratives, if you take them too seriously, they will lead to a closure of your mind and what I've called in the past paradigm lock. Paradigm lock is when you get locked into a single paradigm and you can't look outside of it. And it's almost like being in a cult. It's obvious that fundamentalist religion creates very bad forms of paradigm lock and why that's a problem. That's pretty obvious to the modern attitude. But what is not obvious to the modernist is that science and rationality can also be a recapitulation of that same problem, but at a higher level. That doesn't mean that science is religion. That's not what postmodernism claims. Rather, what postmodernism recognizes is that it's an epistemic paradigm. And that every epistemic paradigm, even those that are secular, can create paradigm lock. For example, libertarianism. You can easily get paradigm locked into libertarianism, even though most libertarians are not even religious. And libertarianism is not a religion, but it's still a paradigm, and you can certainly get locked into it. Likewise with Marxism. Marxism is not a religion, but many, many people got paradigm locked into that, and still do today. Postmodernism says that there are no definite answers when it comes to the exploration of reality. Really, postmodernism is recognition that reality is a lot more complicated than modernism or pre-modernism made it out to be. The more we learn about the world, the more science we do, the more philosophy we do, the more things we discover out there, the more cultures we interact with, the more we see that we can have small local understanding about this thing or that phenomena. But we never get a definite final answer the way that the Christian might assume. the way the Muslim might assume, or even the way that modernist scientists would assume, like, oh, okay, we figured out evolution and that's it. But the more we study evolution, the more we realize that we don't really understand evolution. And this whole idea of random mutation, maybe that's not quite really what's going on there. And so postmodernism wants to say that we can't have a final say on any aspect of reality. There's no closure. And there's some truth in that. Now, how much truth there is in that, that's all up for debate. Right? So a lot of these points, when I present them, remember, I'm presenting a steel man of postmodernism. I'm presenting it in such a way that it's going to look quite convincing to you. But then the question is going to arise in your mind, well, what are the limits? Is it really true that there are no definite answers and that everything is infinitely open, no closure whatsoever? For example, can we close the case on a round earth or not? Or do we need to keep that open? Well, a modernist would say, no, we have to close that. That's long settled. You know, we've killed that. We've killed that zombie. It's buried in the ground. We've put the nails in the coffin. That's what a postmodernist would say. I mean, that's what a modernist would say. And a postmodernist would say, I mean, look, we've taken that attitude many times in the past towards many other things, and then history has shown that we got it wrong. So let's not be so eager to close discussion down, which of course can infuriate the modernist, because the modernist wants to just say, look, science is science, objectivity is objectivity, the world out there is just the world, the earth is round, that's just what it is, let's just move on. Why are we wasting time on this philosophical mumbo jumbo? It's just wasting our time when we can be out there spending our time doing good science, helping the world, helping improve society and so forth. Well, this is where the conflict comes in, right? See, when you have two different paradigms, they could both make a pretty good case about their side. But then how do you actually adjudicate which one is more correct than the other? And also you have to be very nuanced here, because up to this point, it might sound like I've been setting it up as though there's three paradigms here, and one of them is going to turn out to be correct, and the other two are going to be wrong. Of course, that's not going to be the conclusion. The reality is that there's going to be truths contained within every of these paradigms, and our job is going to be to sift through this complex, hairy mess. So you don't need to make a false choice here. There's not a false dichotomy where you need to side with one or the other, defend one or the other. You have to see the nuances and what each one of them is getting at that is valuable and worthwhile, and also what it's missing. Let me go back just a little bit here and also address the issue of Marxism. Some conservatives might wonder, well, how is Marxism modernism and not postmodernism? Technically, Marxism is modernism because Marxism is a grand narrative. Marxism is a meta-narrative which tries to explain all of human economics through this lens of lower class, upper classes controlling and dominating the lower classes. The lower classes need to rise up, overthrow the upper classes, and only then can we have a decent economic system and a decent society. That's just like one lens. And you can see that if you look at the world through that lens, you're going to tend to see the world only in that way. And then it's going to create a reinforcing self-confirmation bias mechanism, which can lead to all sorts of, devastating problems that happened in the 20th century with Marxism and communism, which conservatives are very sensitive to and very aware of, and rightly so, because there was a lot of bad stuff that came from this kind of implementation of Marxism. Well, that's the problem with when you get paradigm locked. But that's not exclusive to Marxism. That's a problem with every paradigm. It's a problem with Nazism. It's a problem with Christianity. It's a problem with Islam, radical Islam. And then you say, well, but Leo, it's not a problem with science and rationality. And the postmodernist says, yes, it is. And we'll get to more examples of how that can be true as we keep going. But let's keep going. So with the postmodern, there's a loss in trust in religion, institutions, mainstream culture, objective morality, science, and rationality. It's sort of like when you live with science and rationality long enough, and you start to see how science and rationality turn into scientism and rationalism, which are different from science and rationality, right? When you take science and rationality and you turn them into exclusive grand narratives and totalizing paradigms, that's when they turn into scientism and rationalism. And then you live with that for a few decades or centuries. You realize how limited that is, and you want something beyond. And so postmodernism is sort of the getting sick of scientism and rationalism and looking for something beyond. Now, whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, that's debatable. We can debate that. Postmodernism is anti-realist. Anti-realist means that you can't just assume that objective stuff exists out there because our mind is entangled with reality. So maybe the stuff that you call objective is actually just your mind. And in fact, maybe everything is just your mind. That's anti-realism in a certain sense. There's different versions of it, but that's it. Now, I'm not saying that these postmodernists are awake or God-realized or anything like that. Don't go too far. They're not that sophisticated. But they're starting to mostly see, the postmodernists is starting to see that a lot of the things that modernism considered objective are actually human constructs. And in that sense, it's anti-realist. Postmodernism can be a denial of objectivity, the very notion of objectivity. Because look, in what sense can we say that science is objective or rationality is objective? Because it's being done by an individual human at the end of the day, or groups of humans, which is even worse. Because when humans get into a group, they're even more biased than they were as individuals in many cases. So how can we say that this stuff is unbiased and neutral and objective? It's hard to argue with that. On the other hand, it does seem like there are certain aspects of science that are kind of objective. Like, do we really want to say that the Earth being round, that's subjective? Sounds kind of silly to say that. On the other hand, it is absolutely true that every single human who has done the science around the roundness of the Earth, he was a subjective agent. And that science itself as a whole scheme is also subjective. And it has biases in it. So, postmodernism is a dethroning of scientific method and rationality as the best and only epistemic systems. But be careful, that doesn't mean that it's a rejection of science entirely. And it doesn't mean that it's the same as the pre-modern criticisms of science. So the pre-modern criticism of science by a creationist is what I would call criticism of science from below, whereas postmodernism attempts to criticize science from above. This distinction, if you want to know more about this, go see my episode series called Deconstructing the Myth of Science. I can't go into that here. So postmodernism sees science as an invented human narrative, not just an objective collection of empirical facts, the way that modernists see it. Postmodernism, in a sense, says that truth is a quaint, naive, and outdated notion. Because really, truth is relative to paradigm, and paradigms can be incommensurable, which means that they can't just be directly compared to each other. Truth is local and not universal. There is no such thing as a canonical truth, because someone has to ultimately say what the truth is, some authority figure. Even within science, there are disputes between scientists, whether this thing is true, that theory is true. How do you adjudicate between them? The postmodernist says that really what we have here is we have a recognition of epistemic anarchy. In the same way that we have a global anarchy amongst nation states, right? In the sense that between Russia and the United States, there is no objective, neutral, higher order unit that can adjudicate a dispute between the United States and Russia and China. Because those, in a sense, represent different paradigms, different political agendas. But who is to say whether the United States is the truthful one, Russia is, or China is. Well, the truth is that there isn't a truth to it. It's all relative, and each one is vying for its own to push its own agenda. And so what we have is a global anarchy amongst nation states in geopolitics. John Mearsheimer talks about this, Professor John Mearsheimer. Very good point, but now we're going to apply that point more deeply, more broadly, to all paradigms and all sense-making systems, right? Who's going to determine which sense-making system is the right one? You see, it becomes very question-begging and circular, because you're going to say, from within my sense-making system, all those other sense-making systems don't make sense, and that's why they're wrong. It's like, yeah, of course, but that's from within your sense-making system. But that's begging the question. The question is, how do we know that your sense-making system is the right one? Because if your sense-making system is wrong, but you're using it to make sense of other sense-making systems, then you're going to misunderstand them, and then you're just going to project your errors out onto other sense-making systems. So you have to somehow go meta and step outside of those, and that's in a sense what postmodernism is pointing to. Now, whether postmodernism is able to deliver on that promise is another matter, but at least the nice thing with postmodernism is that it recognizes that, whereas many modernists, scientific and rationalist type of people, they don't understand this. That's what they're missing. That's why they're not postmodern. This is a critical insight. And this insight gets us into the nature of, not the nature of, but really the issue of relativity and relativism. So postmodernism is relativism, a deeper grasp of relativism and relativity than any of the previous worldviews could grasp. And for this, of course, postmodernism gets criticized a lot because relativity can be easily strawmanned, misunderstood, misapplied, abused, weaponized. And in this way, it's very easy to ridicule someone for being a relativist. And we're going to get very deep into this topic in a future, part 2 of this series, because it's a really, really tricky issue of understanding how to make sense of relativism. But everyone has to admit to a certain degree of relativism. For example, if you just take an elephant, is an elephant large or small? Well, it's large relative to a human, but it's small relative to the moon. So that's just a very crude, simple, stupid example of relativity that even a child can understand, right? So there's actually, it's not just that simple. It's like there's an actual insight that you can have in your mind, profound insight where you realize that an elephant by itself has no scale, and it can't be small and it can't be large. If you just have an elephant in a vacuum with no other objects next to it, you literally cannot tell whether the elephant is large or small. It's not just that you can't tell, it's that literally the elephant is not small and it is not large. That's the insight. But now you can take that insight and apply it at higher levels and in much broader contexts. And when you do, shit gets very crazy. And a lot of people are not comfortable with shit getting very crazy because it fucks with your mind a lot. And so the premodernists and the modernists really don't like it when you start to apply postmodern relativism to their pet worldviews. Good luck getting a Christian to admit that Christianity is just one religion out of many and that they're all equally valid or all equally false. Good luck getting a Christian to see that because they're attached to it. Well, the same problem happens with the rationalist and the scientist, is like good luck getting them to understand that that's just one relative paradigm. Postmodernism wants to say that there is no one truth, but that there are many truths. And that truth is relative to perspective. You say something is true, but really when you're saying something is true, what's really going on? What's really going on is you're saying that thing is true according to my nervous system and my sense-making schemes. So when you're saying the earth is round, what you're really saying is the earth is round relative to my eyes and my nervous system. And maybe for a different creature, the earth isn't round. Now, of course, that's not what the flat earthers are talking about. The flat earthers are not postmodernists. You have to be careful about that. See, just because there are certain truths within relativism and certain true aspects of postmodernism does not mean that all of a sudden all the crazy conspiracy theorists and pseudoscientists and crackpots in the world and on social media, that all of a sudden all of them, they get license to spew their bullshit and spread their false ideas and propaganda. That's not what postmodernism is saying. So you have to be careful not to strawman postmodernism in that way. Because see, the modernists would say, well, Leo, this is very dangerous because see, if we start to dethrone science and rationality, that starts to open the door, Pandora's box, to anything goes. Now we're going to be infested with pseudoscience and conspiracy theories and lunacies of all sorts. And this is going to lead to the destruction of society and culture. You're not wrong in seeing that threat. But the postmodernists would say, just because that threat is there does not mean that the things postmodernism is identifying as valid are not valid. See? Yes, moving beyond the modern presents us with new challenges, as new dangers and epistemic threats. And we'll have to address and deal with those, and maybe we won't be able to catch them all, and then there's actually going to be some damage done, but that's just the cost of moving beyond modernism. That's what the postmodernists would say. In the same way that, if you talk to as a modernist, let's say you're a modernist, and you try to convince a fundamentalist Muslim to accept modernism, see, you're going to have the same problem because the pre-modern fundamentalist Muslim is going to say, well, but it's very dangerous to do all this, liberalism and individualism and feminism and universal human rights and atheism and secularism. This is going to lead to the collapse of morality and society. And you as a modernist would say, yeah, but even if those dangers exist, I'll grant you those dangers, but we got to move on. We got to do science. We got to be rational. We got to question things. And if your Islam turns out to be irrational and unscientific, then we're going to throw it away. And of course, the pre-modernist person says, no, you can't do that. I need that. That's my whole life. Well, of course, the scientist says the same thing to the postmodernist. So postmodernism rejects the correspondence theory of truth. Postmodernism says that truth is a much more complicated thing than simply finding facts out in the world, some objective reality. Reality is not a simple thing that we can just map. Postmodernism says that all facts are theory-laden and value-laden. You don't just find facts out in the world. Even the very notion of which facts come to your attention is already a selective, biased process. There are many facts in the world that you're completely disinterested in, and you will never identify, and you will never even write into an equation. You'll never even do science on them. Why? Simply because you're biased, and you have to pick certain facts over others to construct your theories and models. Postmodernism wants to say that we can't rise above interpretations to get to the facts because we're so entangled and drowning in infinite interpretations, and that what most people call facts are just interpretations. Even something like the earth being round, a postmodernist could make the case that that's not a fact, that's an interpretation, if you want to get really technical about it. Now, postmodernism can come in various degrees of radicalness. You can have mild forms of it, or you can have very extreme forms of it. In the most extreme forms, postmodernism would be a denial of objective facts, period. But I think in practice, most postmodernists would not do that because it's pretty difficult to maintain that position in practice and to live that in your life. So in practice, what they'll do is they'll play a little bit loose around this topic, and they'll try to deny objective facts by trying to relativize them through stuff like what I was just talking about with interpretations. Because ultimately, the postmodernists would want to say that nobody has unbiased access to truth. You're always looking at truth as a subject, through somebody's eyes. And whereas the modernist would admit that, but say, it's not that important, we can get beyond it, the postmodernist says, no, you can't get beyond it. This is an intractable problem. And if you try to treat it as though, let's just move beyond it and just try to be neutral as possible, the postmodernist says that's going to fail. And you're playing this denial game. You're denying your own subjectivity and bias, and that's going to lead to problems. Postmodernism is anti-foundationalist, which means that there's no ground for anything. You can't ground any epistemic scheme or philosophical system in anything. We have epistemic anarchy. There's no single correct interpretation, no single way to read a text. See, when a pre-modern Christian reads the Bible, usually they read it quite literally, and they take it as though there's a single interpretation of the Bible. So in the Bible, when it says to stone homosexuals, pre-modernist reads that and says, okay, yeah, we're going to be stoning homosexuals. That's what God wants us to do. The postmodernists would say something like this. Reading the Bible is always an interpretive process. You're always interpreting things, and you could interpret them however you want. And in fact, there's no such thing as an original intent to what was written in the Bible. See, the Christian might even say that, yeah, there are different interpretations of the Bible, but there's only one correct interpretation of the Bible. And that's what the writers of the Bible meant. The postmodernist is going to say, no, there's not even that. Because even if there was first of all, the Bible wasn't written by a single person, so they could have had different intents. So whose intent is the right intent? Already a problem there. But even beyond that, if it was written by a single person, like let's say the Quran, written by a single person, it's still a problem. Because the postmodernist says that when you're reading the Quran, it's not just about the intent that Muhammad had in writing the Quran. It's about how us today, we're in a co-creative process when we read the Quran. We're not just passively getting information from the Quran. We're also taking that information and spinning it through our minds and interpreting it relative to current modern context or postmodern context. And so it's not even what Muhammad meant that is important. It's also what we want the text to mean to us. See, this is a much more sophisticated way of reading texts. And a lot of what postmodernism is, it was a scheme that was invented to loosen up the way that we read texts, whether literature, philosophy, or even science. You can loosen it up such that once you loosen it up and deconstruct some of these assumptions of some of these texts, what ends up happening is you're kind of opening Pandora's box to interpret any text any way you want. Because the very idea that a text has one correct interpretation, postmodernism wants to deny that. So how might this apply in the real world? Well, look, if you're watching my videos, you can consider all this that I'm saying as text. That's what text means. It doesn't have to literally be words on a page. Text. I'm giving you ideas. Now, if you look at my work through a modernist lens, you might look at it and you might say, okay, so Leo has some specific worldview that he's trying to communicate to me. And that worldview, maybe I could misunderstand it, right? As you're listening to my words, you can misunderstand stuff. It could take you years to understand a single one of these videos in their fullness. But eventually you'll say, well, okay, eventually there's still such a thing as objectively what Leo meant. Either I'll get that or I won't get that, but there is such a thing. Because after all, Leo did have some kind of intention to create this. Whether he's wrong or right, it doesn't really matter. He had some kind of intent, even if he's wrong about everything. Okay, that's sort of a modernist view. A postmodernist would say, there's not even such a thing as what Leo meant. Because what Leo meant, he himself didn't even know everything he meant. Because the idea that Leo has full transparency over his own mind and why he's talking the things he's talking, he himself doesn't even know these things. But it's even more complicated than that because there's a co-creative process. You as the audience are participating in this process of learning this information, and you could interpret it in ways that you need, right? So just because I have my own ideas of what I want you to take away from this video, you might take away the opposite of what I intended. And that might be right for you, given your worldview, your biases, your needs, the complexity of your mind, right? Because I don't know what your mind needs and what's right for you. And postmodernism wants to create space for this to happen. Otherwise, that needs to be denied. So there's pros and cons that come with this. One of the pros here is that, look, we're opening up interpretation. That means you can read the Bible and you can find new insights in the Bible that nobody else has ever found, just because you're reading it in this much more interesting, creative way. For example, look, this gets so interesting and so it's just amazing. What does this? The way that postmodernism can open your mind is incredible, right? But there's dangers to it. But just look at how this opens your mind. So in the Bible, when it says we need to stone homosexuals, a postmodernist can read that and say, oh, but the entire Bible was just a joke. The context for that statement is that the whole Bible was just a joke by God on humans to see if we're stupid enough to believe what's written in there. And so when it says stone homosexuals, if you are stupid enough to believe that, then you'll literally go stone homosexuals. Or if you get it, like if you're smart, like a postmodernist, you'll get it and you'll see that the whole thing is just a joke to test your intelligence. Now, that's an alternative, radical alternative interpretation to what the Bible is. Now, if you give that interpretation to a fundamentalist pre-modern Christian, you're gonna blow his head. He's gonna blow a gasket because you've completely twisted it and inverted everything about the Bible. Because he spent his whole life treating the Bible as though it was serious, not a joke. And here you are, some college postmodernist comes along and just shits all over the Bible by saying the whole thing is just a joke. And look, here's the rub of this whole situation. Ask yourself this: who's true? I mean, what's the truth in this situation? Who's right? Is the Christian right or is the postmodernist right? The Christian will want to say, no, it's absolutely the case that the Bible is not a joke. It's the literal word of God. And the postmodernist would say, there is no such thing as who's right. The postmodernist is not claiming that the Bible is a joke, because that would be a definitive, objective claim. Rather, the postmodernist wants to claim that, look, the Bible, in a sense, is a blank slate. It could be the Word of God. It could be a forgery. It could be a hoax. It could be a joke. It could be all sorts of things. And there's no one way that it is. It is however we decide that it is. A Christian might decide that it's the Word of God, and then I might decide that it's just a joke. And that's just a subjective nature of reality. That's what subjectivity means. That's what it means, these sort of micro narratives rather than one grand narrative. Are you seeing how profound this is? Profound, profound, profound. Now, I'm not even claiming who's right or wrong here. I'm just presenting to you this view in the most steel-manned way. So the postmodernist says that there is no one perspective that can capture reality because the nature of reality is that it's perspectival and fluid. A radical postmodernist may even go so far as to reject standards of logic, rational discourse, proof, and evidence. A lot of people have difficulty with this. This issue of rationality and rationalism is so hairy and thorny and tricky and self-deceptive that I'm going to have a whole series just deconstructing rationality. That's coming. That's a very advanced topic. But just to give you a little bit of a taste for it here. Look, in the end, logic is one way to interface with reality. So is rational discourse. So is proof and evidence. And of course, notions of proof and evidence, what counts as legitimate proof and evidence, we've talked about in the past. I've explained how this is a highly biased and relative notion, right? What counts as proof and evidence for one person won't for another person. When a Christian reads the Bible, he sees proof and evidence in that. Whereas when a scientist reads the Bible, he doesn't see any proof or evidence. To the Christian, his worldview seems logical and rational. More logical, more rational than the view of an atheist. To an atheist, atheism seems logical and rational, and religion seems absurd. And to an atheist, postmodernism seems irrational. To a postmodernist, logic and rationality itself seems irrational and illogical, because just one paradigm for looking at the world. Nowhere in the universe is it written that everything should be logicized. There are many other ways to interface with the world than through logic. And logic, you can ultimately realize, is a kind of a bias. For example, and there's also a sort of a masculine-feminine bias here too, because in a sense, the male mind, the masculine, is much more logical than the feminine. And if you've ever been in a relationship with a very feminine woman, they're not very logical in the way that they interact with reality, but that doesn't mean that their whole worldview is wrong or false or untruthful or invalid. The feminine has a sort of an intuitive, fuzzy, feely way of understanding and making sense of reality. Oftentimes, it doesn't square with the masculine way of making sense of reality, but that doesn't mean the masculine is better than the feminine. So see, postmodernism points this out to us. Because otherwise what we would have, if we didn't have these postmodern insights, what we would have instead is we would have a domination of one paradigm over all the other paradigms. Either Christianity would dominate, or secular materialism, atheism would dominate, or the masculine would dominate the feminine, or the West would dominate the East. And we've lived through millennia of this kind of domination of one dominant group over another, and we've discovered that it doesn't lead to very good results. When the Nazis try to dominate Europe, it doesn't lead to good results. When the West tries to dominate the East, not so good. When a man tries to dominate a woman, not so good for the relationship. When science tries to dominate everything, you might think that that's going to be good. That's going to lead to the best possible outcome. And in reality, what you discover is that, no, not so much. Not so much. Because there's a lot of bias there. A lot of truth is being missed. Because truth doesn't fall into the little container of science and logic. Even though some of it does, but not all of it. So really, it's a question of completeness. So postmodernism emphasizes the subjective versus the objective. Postmodernism rejects essentialism. Essentialism is the idea that things have an unchanging essence to them. There is an essence to what it means to be a man, and there is an essence to what it means to be a woman, and there is an essence to science, and there is an essence to humanity, to mankind versus animals. There's these essences, and you can get to these essences. No, is what postmodernism says. Postmodernism says there is no transcendental. What does that mean? I mean, it's so complicated to explain these things. I don't have time to explain that. That would take 20 minutes to explain. I'll explain that maybe in other episodes. Moving on. Postmodernism says that truth is constructed by language, culture, and power. Postmodernism recognizes just how much language shapes our reality and how power operates through discourse. So in the past, we used to think of power as just like one military dominating another with weapons and technology. But really, postmodernism says that power is much more sneaky than that. Power infects our knowledge and our truth claims and our discourse and our culture. And that's primarily where the real power games happen, not through the military. And this is something that previous sense-making schemes didn't appreciate enough. There's bias that is baked into our language. There's metaphysics and assumptions baked into our language. Postmodernism also wants to say that there's no correspondence between language and truth, the way that modernism assumed. Language is self-referential, and language corresponds to more language in this complex web that we call language. This is what the work of Jacques Derrida highlighted. Postmodernism stresses social construction. A lot of the things that we used to think were objective or true or natural are actually socially constructed. Postmodernism says that God is a social construction. Of course, good luck telling that to a fundamentalist Christian or Muslim. Of course, the modernists might agree that God is a social construction. So it's not like postmodernism and modernism disagree on everything. Be careful. There's plenty of overlap, and you could definitely take a position that is a blend of modernism and postmodernism. These are not exclusive positions. You can be half and half and make that work. You know, your mind is very sneaky. It can make all sorts of things work. You could even blend the pre-modern with the postmodern. I'll actually give you an example of that coming up here in a minute. So don't underestimate the cleverness of your mind. Your mind can do all sorts of mental gymnastics to rationalize and, square any circle. Postmodernism views history as a perspective, not objective truth. You've heard this before, right? After all, how do we know what the true history was? The history was written by the winners, by the victors, by the oppressors, and all the people who got killed and suppressed, all the slaves. They never got to write their history. And so, in fact, what we have is a very biased Western history. That's classic postmodernism right there. Postmodernism is deeply relativistic, which means that a belief in truth, it means that truth, morality, and knowledge are not absolute, but always relative to culture, context, paradigm, identity, perspective. Postmodernism recognizes that morality is relative, because every culture throughout every era of human history had different moralities, very different moralities. And they all claim them to be absolute. And of course, looking from a meta perspective now, we see that they're not that. Some culture claims that abortion is evil, and another culture has unlimited abortion rights. Who's right? Postmodernism wants to say neither one is right. The notion of abortion is a social construction. Whether it's right or wrong is a social construction, and it's relative. In a sense, there is no right and wrong, and no better and worse. That's postmodernism. There is no moral basis for passing judgment on anything. There's no universal values applicable across all cultures and contexts. Postmodernism is pluralistic, which means acceptance and celebration of diversity of perspectives and interpretations. Postmodernism is recognition that totalizing viewpoints can dominate other viewpoints, not because they are true, but because they wield power. That's critical, right? Because a modernist would want to say, well, yeah, there's a lot of different perspectives out there, and the ones that dominate and win out, they win out because they're true. And postmodernism says, no, that's rarely the case. They win out in most cases simply because they're more selfish and they're more ruthless in their use of power. And so what postmodernism identifies correctly is that objectivity, science, and rationality can be weaponized to marginalize minority viewpoints. For example, we can use science race IQ science to justify that black people are less intelligent than white people and therefore they should be enslaved. And we could say that that's not just our opinion, man. That's objectively true. That's science. And there are many examples throughout history that a postmodernist can cite to you where, in fact, science, objectivity, and rationality have been misused in this way to dominate others. Science used to say that women are weaker than men, not just physically, but mentally too, and that there are certain jobs that women could not do. Women couldn't compete in sports. Women couldn't do strenuous physical labor. Women couldn't work in a factory. Women couldn't, be a pilot of an airplane. Women couldn't be an astronaut. And it wasn't just that they couldn't. This was objective, scientific, and rational to believe this. You can find many more examples like this throughout history. And these are valid examples. There have been plenty of misuses of science. And science does tend to, want to whitewash or kind of like sweep those problems and errors under the rug. As though like, well, Leo, yeah, that stuff used to happen 100 years ago, but it doesn't happen today because today's science has finally matured and evolved and it's finally now rational. That stuff that was happening, Leo, that was irrational, unscientific stuff. That was pseudoscience. But again, as I talked about in my series, Deconstructing the Myth of Science, it's not so easy to say what is and isn't pseudoscience or what is and isn't rational. The problem is that this notion of rational is a very self-justifying, self-serving notion because everyone who believes what they believe that it's rational. A Christian thinks he's being rational. And so when this is the case, the problem of distinguishing the rational from the irrational, this is what the postmodernist is pointing to. For example, you can use science to marginalize people by calling them insane or mentally ill. For example, homosexuals 100 years ago were oftentimes called mentally ill, having some kind of mental disorder, and then they were locked into insane asylums. And that was all done under the guise of science, rationality, and good, medicine, proper medicine. See? So what postmodernism wants to do is to say that, look, your idea that science is this neutral, transcendental method beyond the human that somehow rises above human selfishness and politics and, power games and biases, that this is a fantasy. That's not how science really works. In reality, science is this tug of war between different factions, different people who are all selfish, have all different kind of survival agendas, and it makes a lot of mistakes and it exhibits a lot of biases. And we have to be very attuned to that to make sure that we don't marginalize minority points of view. Postmodernism says that knowledge paradigms are entangled with power and politics. People in power define and construct truth and knowledge. And look, if you look at our school system and you look at academia, it's very political in terms of what they're allowed to teach, what they're not allowed to teach, what books are considered acceptable, what books are considered unacceptable. This is very political. It's not like you just get to go to school and learn about anything. Some higher up, some government bureaucrat is making decisions about that. And who's to say what's the right decision? Postmodernism says that since there is no objective truth and humans make stuff up all the time, they make stuff up to gain power and survival advantage. Of course. The primary thing in human discourse and even intellectual activity is not truth-seeking. It's actually survival. even academics and intellectuals who are supposed to be these arbiters of truth, if you actually look at how they operate, the way academia works, it's a very dog-eat-dog world. They're all fighting with each other, fighting for grants, looking for money, looking for patronage, getting corrupted by business, trying to survive in academia. It's a rough game, rough game. A lot of politics goes on there. Postmodernism says that social norms and traditions can be oppressive. That's fundamentally the problem with the pre-modern, because the pre-modern has these very rigid rules. In Afghanistan, women can't even go to school beyond like 5th grade. But they believe that that's like a rule laid down by God, that women should not go to school beyond 5th grade because they need to be good, loyal wives. Is that really true? Is that right? Now, here's where it gets really, you got to be really careful, because you might say, well, then postmodernism means that we need to liberate the women of Afghanistan. That's actually not what postmodernism means. That's modernism. You have to be very careful here, because see, when a modernist looks at the situation in Afghanistan, women's rights in Afghanistan, the modernist will say, man, it's so bad that these poor girls are being abused, and it's the patriarchy. We got to destroy the patriarchy in Afghanistan and make it like a bastion of democracy and Western values. That's not postmodernism. That's modernism. Modernism holds universal human rights. If you believe the women of Afghanistan should be feminists, you're a modernist. Postmodernism says Afghanistan is its own culture. We need to respect that culture. They have their own point of view. If they want to oppress women, that's what's right for them. That's what they believe. Leave them alone. See, so be very careful, because here postmodernism and social justice warrior politics, now there's a very dangerous and complex, hairy conflation between these two, which happens. And it even happens within postmodernists. So many people who consider themselves postmodernists are not really strict enough in their postmodernism to resist the urge to want to liberate the women of the girls of Afghanistan. So in this sense, they're not being pure postmodernists. They're actually drinking from the cup of modernism when they try to do that. Like I said, or maybe I didn't say, but I'll keep saying it again and again because it's so important, is that almost nobody is a postmodernist in practice. Because it's first of all, it's such an advanced, but also such a strange and impractical attitude just for living in life. It would be very difficult for you to do politics, to win elections, to get people rights through postmodernism. Really, you need modernism for that, which is where most people are at. Postmodernism says that deconstructing and questioning social norms and hierarchies is a good thing and helps to undo domination. Now, look, it's so tricky because, look, in a sense, postmodernism does have a bias to it. It's not bias-free. Like, in my ideal of postmodernism would be so attuned to bias that it would be aware of its own biases. But in practice, that is like beyond postmodernism. Postmodernism is not that sophisticated. So postmodernism does have a bias in the following sense. Postmodernism wants to see that we have all these different competing epistemes and sense-making systems and different worldviews and cultures. And postmodernism wants to say that some of them are dominating other ones. And what postmodernism says, like if postmodernism has any kind of like moral prescription or moral imperative or like practical political consequences, it might be this. It's that if you see some value system dominating some lower value system, then what you want to do is you want to equalize them. right? You want to remove the domination, undo the domination. And the way you do that is by questioning and deconstructing the dominant worldview. So if science is dominating religion, we want to deconstruct science so that science drops and religion rises, and there's sort of parity between the two. And if you could also frame it this way, if the men in Afghanistan are dominating the women in Afghanistan, what we want to do is we want to deconstruct the patriarchy in Afghanistan such that the women and the men are at parity. That could also be a valid form of postmodernism. Of course, that can come with its own problems, but that's sort of some of the logic there. Postmodernism challenges traditional dichotomies such as man versus woman, nature versus culture, West versus East, and so on. All the dualities that I talked about in my 3-part series, Understanding Duality, all of those are challenged. Because what postmodernism recognized, especially Jacques Derrida recognized this, is that all of our language is made up of these dualities or dichotomies. And then how we use language dictates our politics and our knowledge and our sense-making schemes. And so if you want to corrupt your sense-making scheme, what you do is you create distinctions. That's what these dichotomies and dualities are. They're distinctions. You create these distinctions, but then what happens when you create a distinction, then you put one half of the distinction on a pedestal and you demonize or marginalize the other half. So for example, man versus woman, and then man is elevated, woman is suppressed, marginalized. Or for example, natural and unnatural, and then the natural is better than the unnatural. Or for example, West and East, and then Western culture is superior to Eastern culture, and then since it's superior in your mind, that means you get to dominate the East, right? Like white versus black, white is superior to black, therefore white is justified in dominating black. Rational versus irrational, the rational gets to dominate the irrational, puts it into an insane asylum. Like America, West versus Middle East, the Middle East is inferior to the West, therefore the West, America gets to dominate and invade the Middle East. And so postmodernism says that that's how modernism and premodernism operate, and postmodernism wants to deconstruct that whole scheme because fundamentally it's untruthful. This marginalization, these traditional dichotomies have all been constructed in such ways as to give some group in society power. See? Like lower class, upper class, and now the upper class, since it constructs this distinction, the upper class can now say we're better than the lower class, therefore we get to dominate and rule the lower classes. And in some sense, that's sick and twisted, right? And so the mind is playing this kind of game, and modernists don't really see it. Pre-modernists see it even less, and postmodernists see it really well, and they want to undo it. Postmodernism is skeptical of the notion of progress. Society isn't necessarily progressing in the way modernists say. Postmodernists say that human nature is socially constructed. All of these things that we thought were biological are really social constructs. This idea that women can't be doctors, that's a social construct. This idea that women can't be good airline pilots, that's a social construct. Even the idea that women can't be good soldiers on the battlefield, that's a social construct. The idea that women can't be good at certain sports, the idea that women can't be good at math and engineering, these are social constructs, is what postmodernism would say. Because human nature itself is a social construct. Postmodernism goes further to identify the relativity of identity. Identity itself, what are you, is relative. Are you really a man or a woman? Were you born a man or a woman? The postmodernists would say, you weren't born a man or a woman. You were born a blank slate, and then society told you that you're a man or a woman, and you bought into it. And furthermore, you bought into the baked-in biases of that dichotomy, and that is actually serving some sort of higher power structures that you're probably not even aware of. And now you're participating in that system of patriarchy or whatever. And you're probably not even aware of it. But with postmodernism, you could be. And then that allows us to change things in a better direction. Or so the postmodernist says. Postmodernism blurs the boundaries between high and low culture. Postmodernism has this element called fragmentation, which is an emphasis on the fractured, nonlinear nature of experience and knowledge. Postmodernism has a feature called intertextuality, which is the recognition that all texts and ideas are interconnected and influenced by each other. So see, the Quran as a text doesn't exist in isolation. The Quran exists in a larger context. It exists in the context of the Bible. And the Bible exists in the context of the Torah, the Old Testament. And then that exists in the context of the pagan religions and even prior religions, ancient Egyptian religion, Zoroastrianism, and Greek and Roman religions and so forth. And so all of this really is the full context for the Quran. But it doesn't stop there, because the Quran now needs to be reinterpreted based on, a millennia of new literature and commentary that has been written upon it. So the Quran doesn't just exist by itself. The Quran is also all the commentary that's been done on the Quran, and all the commentary on the commentary that's been done on the Quran, and also all the science textbooks that have been written, because that influences what is said in the Quran. That's intertextuality. That's interesting, very interesting. Another feature of postmodernism is hyperreality, which is the blurring of the distinction between reality and simulation. Are we in a matrix? How about all the media that we're creating? All the AI stuff, all the stuff on social media, all of this is deeply, deeply constructed, and all of this is influencing the minds of young people and old people alike, brainwashing grandmas and young girls and young boys with the red pill and black pill content, and all this, the Instagram fake girls on Instagram with plastic faces and noses and fake makeup and filters and all this. This is what we're calling hyper reality. What is real anymore? We don't even fucking know. I could be an AI right here sitting talking to you, and it's so plausible at this point that I could replace myself with an AI in a few years. You won't even know. I could be on the beach sipping pina coladas and smoking DMT, and you wouldn't even know it. That's hyper reality. There's also this thing called this feature of postmodernism, which is pastiche and parody. So it's a mixing of styles and references from different periods and cultures. So we're creating this kind of like messy, hairy melting pot. A lot of cultural appropriation going on. Okay, the next critical feature of postmodernism is something called self-reflexivity. Self-reflexivity, the ability of a system to reflect on itself. Of course, this is critical to our work here with Actualized.org and with spirituality, but really it's the ability to be able to reflect and examine one's own biases and assumptions. So every paradigm or sense-making scheme has a certain level of self-reflexivity. For example, if you're bought into Christianity, fundamentalist Christianity, how much self-reflexivity is there? Not very much, because Christianity doesn't question its own biases and assumptions. It doesn't subject itself to the rigors of scientific method or even philosophical investigation. It's just all assumed as absolutely true. So very little self-reflexivity there. Now, science as a paradigm has more self-reflexivity. Science is able to weed out false beliefs, false science, crackpottery, and so forth, and it's able to improve itself. And that's a laudable feature of science. But the degree of self-reflexivity science has is still not that deep. If you take it even deeper, as I did in the series deconstructing the myth of science, that's an example of extreme self-reflexivity within science. And I'm going to do a similar series on rationality. That's going to be meta-rationality. When you do an extreme level of self-reflexivity on science or rationalism, what you end up with is an examination of the biases and assumptions of those paradigms, and then you end up transcending those paradigms. And so postmodernism is about the ability for a paradigm to do this kind of deep self-reflexivity. And of course, this gets very strange loopy, as I've talked in my episode, Reality is a Strange Loop. It's going to get very strange loopy because now you're going to wonder, well, Leo, what about postmodernism? How self-reflexive is postmodernism? And the answer is, it depends. It can be quite self-reflexive, but not enough for my taste. For me, there's nothing, there's never enough short of infinite self-reflexivity. That's what you need to get where we're really going. But postmodernism has a decent amount of self-reflexivity to the point where a postmodernist could even say that, look, and you might say, well, isn't postmodernism a grand narrative itself? Like, if we're saying that modernism is a grand narrative, what about postmodernism? But see, a good postmodernism has a good answer to this. A good postmodernism says that, look, don't take postmodernism as a grand meta-narrative. Rather, take it as one perspective. Which is coming from a certain historical period. It's historically relative, you know. It's relative to a certain Western culture, to academia and so forth. So if postmodernism is really operating properly, which oftentimes it isn't, but if it is, then it will have to negate itself. Any process of skepticism ultimately ends up negating itself. So this is not a mistake, this is the feature. This is what self-reflexivity means. But you know, there's a lot of paradoxes and weird stuff that starts to happen when you go that deep. Postmodernism is a valorization of marginalized voices and perspectives. It's anti-imperial, anti-colonial. It's a promotion of cultural and political diversity. It's an elimination of rigid standards. It can turn into extreme non-traditionalism, breaking norms for the sake of breaking norms. And in the most extreme form, this can turn into actually this intellectual movement known as absurdism, which was sort of popular in the early 20th century, absurdism, which is this idea that everything, after a certain amount of philosophy, you do philosophy long enough, eventually it becomes so self-reflexive and so self-masturbatory that everything looks ridiculous to you. Everything is equally ridiculous. You know, people dying in the Middle East, that's just a joke. And, you know, kids starving in China, it's all a joke, right? Everything becomes a joke. Everything is ridiculous. Like life loses its meaning, has no point. You kind of fall into this cycle of nihilism. And absurdism, like the quintessential example in my mind of absurdism, as I was reading about this, especially in Soviet Russia in the early 20th century, there's this movement of absurdism. And this one absurdist poet would stand in front of an audience, you know, big audience gathers, and he's going to say this profound poem. And he starts reading his poem, and his poem is written in just gibberish. Kuila, ha, blah, 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 gibberish. He's just speaking gibberish. And this is his poem, but he's speaking it as though he's saying something profound. This is the peak absurdism. So in that sense, it can get pretty silly, right? All right, so that's my definition for you of postmodernism. There's a lot of factors there. Now, I should just underscore for you that you're going to be really hard-pressed to find a human being out in the world, in the real world, who's going to subscribe to all of this that I just mentioned. That's a lot to ask for. I presented you with an idealized version of a very, very broad, loose attitude which can be applied for making sense of reality. In practice, when this broad attitude is applied, it's applied in a very messy, haphazard, half-baked way, mixed with elements of mixed with elements of modernism and even pre-modernism, all in this sort of pastiche, which is kind of ironic and kind of true to form because that's, see, The pre-modern can be a very rigid paradigm. Modernism can be a very rigid paradigm, and the postmodernism, it's not such a rigid paradigm. Because by its very nature, postmodernism wants to say that the whole notion of having a rigid paradigm is the wrong way to go about life. And so, given that, if you're living in accordance with that, then you're going to be living in this kind of like very loosey-goosey way, which is actually exactly the problem that modernists and pre-modernists have with the postmodern. They don't like how loosey-goosey and sloppy it all is. Once you open the Pandora's box with this kind of degree of relativism and social construction and questioning all this bias, in a sense, you're deconstructing human society and civilization and everything good and true that we know about the world. Yeah, that's the postmodern. That's the feature of it, and that's the bug of it, depending on your point of view. Now let's go through a list of some of the most prominent postmodern philosophers. You should be aware of them. I'm not going to give you a long explanation of all their philosophies. We don't have time for that here, but just a little brief overview, just so you get a sense. First, we have Michel Foucault. What was his big idea? His big idea was how knowledge and partial truth serves power structures and institutions. Especially, for example, with how society criminalizes people and calls certain people insane or mentally ill for their sexual preferences, for example. So society marginalizes these so-called degenerates and deviants, people who are gay, people who are queer, people who are gender fluid, people who are just weird and sort of anti-mainstream, people who have neurodivergent, brain chemistry and so forth. Michel Foucault did a history of this kind of stuff, and he realized that these people were treated very badly throughout history. Then we have the philosopher Jean Lyotard, who said that his big idea was that grand narratives are no longer credible. Knowledge is local and not universal. We've discussed that. The next philosopher is Jacques Derrida, who we've also discussed, and his big idea was that there are these dualities within language which structure how we make sense of reality, and that these dualities are not fair, but always not always, but in most cases there's a marginalization going on where one aspect of the duality is being favored over the other, and that this is unfair and leads to all sorts of problems. And also, Jacques Derrida identified that texts can be interpreted in many different ways because texts are really just constructions out of all these different dualities, and these dualities can be interpreted in different ways, giving multiple meanings to texts. So there's no one right way to interpret a text. Then we have the philosopher Jean Baudrillard, mouthful, Jean Baudrillard, and his big idea was that the distinction between reality and representation has collapsed, leading to a world of simulacra, which is stuff like reality TV, fake social media, artificial flavors in food, AI images, virtual reality, this kind of stuff that I just was ranting about. So hyper reality, that's simulacra, right? It's hard to tell what's real and what's not anymore. And in a certain sense, our representations of reality take on a reality of their own. And then we get lost in it. Our maps from science, our maps of reality get confused with reality itself, with the territory. It's this sort of idea. Then we have the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, whose big idea was that thought should be nomadic and rhizomatic, resisting hierarchical and binary structures. So just loosening up the way that we think. Then there's the philosopher Judith Butler, and she's famous for her idea that gender is not a natural biological phenomenon, but a performative and fluid one. So what it means to be a man or a woman isn't really dictated so much by biology, but by our performances and by social constructions. Men behave in certain ways and do certain things, and that's what makes them men. There's certain masculine ways in which men need to act, puff themselves up. It's actually very interesting. If you look at someone like Andrew Tate, Andrew Tate is a perfect example that if you explain to Andrew Tate Judith Butler, of course he's going to call bullshit, and he's going to say Judith Butler was just a stupid bitch. She didn't understand anything. What it means to be a man is just to have high testosterone and a dick. But what's interesting is that as he says that, how he's going to be acting is exactly what Judith Butler was saying, is that his whole shtick, his whole social media persona is this construction. It's not the real Andrew Tate. It's a simulacra, really. His character that he plays, this sort of hyper macho masculine character who's sitting there shirtless with tattoos and a cigar and girls around him, and he's talking like a macho man should talk, and he's being kind of puffed up, and he has this bravado to him, and so what Judith Butler says, that is what it's like to be a man, and in a sense, Andrew Tate has become this cartoon caricature of himself, of what a man is. Very interesting. Then we have Richard Rorty, who I quoted to you at the beginning of this section on postmodernism, and his big idea was that there is no objective truth, that really truth is socially justified beliefs. That's what really truth means. And that philosophy should abandon the search for foundations and for ultimate truth because there is no such a thing. And Rorty says, quote, "Truth is what your contemporaries let you get away with." End quote. How's that? How's that for a definition of truth? Do you agree with it or not? Then we have Paul Feyerabend. I talked about him, quoted a bit about him in my series on deconstructing the myth of science. His basic idea was that there is no such thing as a universal scientific method, and I explained why that is in that series. Then we have the philosopher of science and historian Thomas Kuhn, whose big idea was the notion of scientific paradigms. The word paradigm comes from him. And his big idea was that different scientific paradigms can be incommensurable with each other. That means you can't adjudicate which paradigm is the right paradigm from within a paradigm, because any adjudication would itself be coming from a paradigm. So in this sense, you get incommensurability, which means that there's no direct comparison. In a sense, what he's saying is that everything is apples and oranges, and you can't really compare it. Then there's the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, postmodernist psychoanalyst, whose big idea was that the self is fundamentally split and alienated, and that full self-knowledge is impossible. And lastly, we have the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, whose big idea is that hidden ideology skews all of our thinking, and that language isn't fundamentally about the truth. It's about lying. So this is actually quite genius of him, It's like that example that I said about interpreting the Bible as just being a joke. Well, in a sense, Zizek has reinterpreted all of human language. The modernist version of language is that, we're using language to try to get to some ultimate truths and laws of nature. And Zizek says that no, usually when you're using language, what you're using it to lie. Look at how the Nazis used it. Look at how the communists used it. Look at how it's used, how the neoliberals use it. Look at how modern politicians use it. Look at how it's used in science. At least half the time it's being used to lie. So that's the list of postmodernist philosophers. Gets you a little bit of a sense of where they're coming from, what their big ideas were. Okay, so now if you're familiar with spiral dynamics, then just for those of you who are, I'm going to quickly make a few connections here. So, this is tricky. Spiral dynamics stage blue, red, and purple, we can call that pre-modern. That's about, 10,000 years ago to 1600 AD. Then around 1600 AD, we got the Renaissance and the Enlightenment era, scientific revolution starts, and that begins the modern era. That's roughly the beginning of the spiral dynamic stage orange. Orange goes up to the 1950s. So from the 1600s to the 1950s, and then in the 1950s and 60s, that's the beginning of spiral dynamic stage green, which is the postmodern era. Now, even though I laid it out this way, it's a little bit oversimplified. I want to just note to be careful not to make a direct one-to-one correlation between pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, and blue, orange, and green spiral stages. These aren't necessarily identical things, so just be careful. I want you to be able to hold these as two separate ways of looking, like two lenses. You have spiral dynamics as one lens. That's good, that's fine, you know that. Now the new lens I'm giving you is pre-modern, modern, postmodern, so use that lens and be able to use them independently, but also you can cross-correlate them and see where there's some overlap. Another note I should make here is that technically we're in the postmodern era. 1960s was the beginning of the postmodern era, and we're still in the postmodern era. However, this is misleading because in practice, it's misleading for multiple reasons. Because first of all, don't forget that these eras, it's not just like one era replaces the other era perfectly. There's a lot of overlap, and they have very long shadows. So the pre-modern and the modern cast very long shadows. That means that there are still billions of people on this planet that are literally just pre-modern, even though we're living in the 21st century. And there are many people on the planet who are just modern. In fact, most people are just modern. And there's very, very few who are solidly postmodern. So make a distinction between a pre-modern, modern, postmodern mind of an individual versus the pre-modern era, the modern era, the postmodern era. These are different things. I'm just spitballing here, but I mean, less than 10% of the global population is going to be truly postmodern. Probably less, maybe 5%. Of course, it varies a lot by region, because if we're talking about the whole globe, we're including Africa and South America, where most people are, in Africa, most people are still like pre-modern, barely coming into the modern. In America and Northern Europe, of course, a lot more modern and more postmodern as well, maybe up to 20% postmodern, maybe 30% in a very, very progressive part of the country. Remember, you can't even talk about a single country like America, because America is so diverse, and really you have to look at it at a region, and even more than a region, you have to look at like individual cities. Because, if you look at New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco, you could say it's very postmodern. But then if you look at Bakersfield, California, it's going to be like pre-modern. So what we have is this messy pastiche of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern people living all next to and around each other and interacting with each other through the internet, which leads to all sorts of epistemic craziness and anarchy, which is our epistemic situation that we find ourselves in. All right? So a very important insight here is that even though we're living in the postmodern era, most people, when they think about these categories, they overestimate themselves because, everyone wants to be in the most advanced, evolved category because it's supposed to be the best, right? Postmodernism is the best, right? It's superior to everything else. So, Leo, if I'm not postmodern, there's something wrong with me. That's not what I'm saying. Be careful not to fall into that trap. The reality is that even the world's most intelligent scientists and academics and philosophers alive right now at MIT, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, and so forth, they're just modernists. They're just modernists. And of course, there can be different reasons for being just a modernist. You could just be a modernist because you think it's true, because you've evaluated postmodernism and realized, there's nothing there, it's just bullshit, and then you just settled on modernism. But that's very different from what most people do. Most people have never understood the things that I'm teaching to you here in this level of clarity and profundity, right? Postmodernism is notoriously complicated and difficult for people to understand, even for academics. A lot of the insights that I've shared with you here, in a certain sense, they seem simple only because I laid them out to you with such brilliant clarity, if I may toot my own horn a bit. You usually don't see this anywhere. And so, in effect, you can have very intelligent, high IQ people who do not understand what postmodernism is, have not grasped the profound insights that I'm talking about here, some of these issues of relativity and dualities and limitations to science and rationality. Very, very few people, less than 1% of human beings understand this stuff really. And so in practice, what you have is you have mostly modernists. Modernists rule the world. Most politicians, bureaucrats, academics, intellectuals are just modernists. And then those few who fancy themselves postmodernists, they're cosplaying as postmodernists and they're actually full of shit. They don't live in accordance with postmodernism. They don't really understand it deeply enough. They don't understand the limits of it, and they certainly haven't transcended it. So they can just be LARPing as a postmodernist. Don't forget that happens a lot too. People can just LARP as things. It's so easy to have a philosophy. You can be a Marxist. You can LARP as a Marxist. You can LARP as a libertarian. Doesn't mean you are one. It's just ideas in your head. It's just mental masturbation. Doesn't mean you live it. It doesn't mean you really understand very much about it. Doesn't mean you're deeply read in this stuff. Doesn't mean you've thought this stuff through. For most people, these are just belief systems and ideologies. And of course, because of that, they're easily hybridized and blended together. So that's also an insight you should keep in mind. All right, now let me read you a long quote, kind of summarizing everything we said here about postmodernism. This is a quote by the philosopher Alexander Dugin. And I'll tell you a little bit more about him when we finish this quote. Dugin says, quote, "The values of rationalism, scientism, and positivism are recognized as veiled forms of repressive totalitarian policies or grand narrative and are criticized. At the same time, this is accompanied by the glorification of total freedom and the independence of the individual from any kind of limitations, including reason, morality, identity, social, ethnic, or even gender, discipline, and so on. This is the condition of postmodernity. Undoubtedly racist is the idea of unipolar globalization. It is based on the idea that the history and values of Western and especially American society are equivalent to universal laws and artificially tries to construct a global society based on what are actually local and historically specific values of democracy, the market, parliamentarianism, capitalism, individualism, human rights, and unlimited technological development. These values are local ones, emerging from the particular development of a single culture, and globalization is trying to impose them on all of humanity as something that is universal and taken for granted. This attempt implicitly argues that the values of all other peoples and cultures are imperfect, underdeveloped, and should be subject to modernization and standardization in imitation of the Western model. Globalization is thus nothing more than a globally deployed model of Western European, or rather Anglo-Saxon, ethnocentrism, which is the purest manifestation of racist ideology." End quote. Alexander Dugin has been called Putin's brain. He's a philosopher, a Russian philosopher, who is very pro the Ukraine war. Some have called him fascist, although he doesn't call himself that. And it's very interesting because Dugin's whole problem, his biggest critique of all of the West is the Enlightenment. Dugin's agenda is to take Russia and the world back to pre-Enlightenment values. So Dugin is actually a pre-modernist at heart, because he believes that the Enlightenment has robbed mankind of its spirit and soul, and that we need to return to the good old classic, conservative, traditional, pre-modern values Christianity and all that. However, Dugin is a very sophisticated thinker. He's not like your typical brain-dead conservative Christian. This guy is very sophisticated, has a very deep grasp of philosophy and Heidegger and postmodernism and so forth. And so in a cynical way, Dugin is a very devilish character. So Dugin, in a cynical, devilish way, is trying to employ his understanding of postmodernism and the fact that postmodernism is, we're in the postmodern era in the West here. His objective is to destroy and undermine the West. So how is he going to do that? By turning the West's own most radical ideas in on themselves in this sort of self-reflexive way. It's very, very clever what he's doing. Really genius, which is why I'm quoting it. Not that I agree with it, but just what I read to you here. It's just one of his quotes. I cherry-picked it, but it's a perfect encapsulation of the postmodern condition. But then he's turning it in on itself, and he's saying that itself is what racism boils down to. So, very, very clever of him to do that. And in a certain sense, is he wrong? I'll leave that up to you. All right, now let's take a look at some examples to show postmodernism in action. We've talked about the theory. Now let's look at some examples to really flesh this out. So, for example, let me take a drink. For example, let's consider homosexuality. Is homosexuality natural? Is it normal? Is it deviant? Is it degenerate? Who's to say? Is there an objective fact of this matter? Not so obvious. How about this issue? Is it true that gay rights should be honored in every society? Is this objectively correct? Should we force the people in Afghanistan to have gay rights? Or in Saudi Arabia? In China? In Russia? Who's to say? How about mental illness? Is mental illness bad or wrong? And what counts as mental illness? Who's to say? Are Christians mentally ill? Are radical Islamists mentally ill? Is being mentally ill a mistake that needs to be cured? Or could it be the case that we just call people mentally ill who we disagree with, whose worldview is too radical for us? But what if mental illness has valuable insights and truths of its own? For example, in ancient and tribal cultures, even today, like in the Amazon and so forth, people with schizophrenia are often become, they deal with their schizophrenia by becoming shamans. Drinking ayahuasca, becoming shamans, becoming medicine doctors. Are these shamans crazy? Or do they have some sort of wisdom that us normies don't have? So who are we to judge the shaman or the schizophrenic? How about autism? Are autistic people really suffering from a disorder? Are they inferior to normies? Or is that just a bias of our culture? Maybe autistic people have abilities that normies don't have. Maybe there's trade-offs, and who are we to say what the trade-offs are or what's good or bad in this situation? Or consider this example. How about a Victoria's Secret model? Is she objectively beautiful? Now, some young guy might say, yeah, of course, Leo, a Victoria's Secret model is objectively beautiful. That's why she gets paid so much money, and that's why she's on the front cover. And then when you put these fat girls on covers the way that, on magazine covers the way they do sometimes, Jordan Peterson complains about this. They put some fat girl model on a magazine cover, and he says, "Oh, this is not beautiful. This is a degrading culture." So, how do we determine what's beautiful? Is what's beautiful objective, or is it a social construct? Is Jordan Peterson just acting out a social construct when he's calling some fat girl not beautiful? And look, that's his perspective. That's his male perspective. If you're a horny male guy, you want to see, hot Victoria's Secret models on ads somewhere. But see, that's the male perspective. There's also the female perspective. But before we get to the female perspective, let's just even notice that even within the male perspective, there's a lot of relativity in terms of what's counted as beautiful. For example, I had a pickup buddy who was into a very specific kind of girl. We would go out, looking for girls together. And I was amazed at how different his taste was in women than mine. Like, he would only approach girls who were thick. It was so weird. Thick. And by thick, he didn't mean fat. And I don't mean fat. Like, they had these like thick thighs and like thick ass and like just like ridiculously thick. And if it wasn't like that, he wouldn't even talk to them. To the point where they were like just beautiful. Like, you could have a beautiful Victoria's Secret model walk by. He wouldn't be interested in her at all because she didn't have the kind of body type he liked. So who's to say what the objectively perfect girl is? Is it Jordan Peterson? Is it me? Is it that guy? Is it an average of all of us? But you have to understand that if you're a guy and you're agreeing with some of these ideas, you have to understand that this is just how you're thinking this way because you're thinking with your dick. See, when a woman thinks about what feminine beauty entails, she has very different ideas because she's not thinking with her dick. She's got a different set of biases. She's looking at the situation in terms of like, well, what kind of ideals do I fit into? Because she's not like the Victoria's Secret model, and you can criticize her most girls aren't. And so you can criticize women, men can criticize women and say, well, the reason that women want to soften the standards of what counts as beautiful is because most of them can't meet the standards and they feel bad about themselves. Right. But the reason you want the standards to be the way you want them is because you want to fuck, right? So whose biases are really the objective truth in this situation? Women, of course, have their own biases because they're women and they want to perceive themselves as being beautiful and desirable, and they need to have that kind of mental model and mental image in order to feel good about themselves and to be able to date and mate. But then guys are doing the same thing just from a different angle. So a postmodernist here would say that there isn't such a thing as objective beauty. Is that true? You decide for yourself. How about when cultures call other cultures barbarian? The ancient Greeks did that, the Romans did that. But who's to say who the real barbarians are? Like the Romans would call the German tribes and the French tribes barbarians, but maybe it was the Roman Empire that were the real barbarians. 40% of the Roman Empire, up to 40% of the Roman population were slaves. And the Roman Empire was expanded through brutal domination and war and killing and raping and pillaging. So who's the real barbarians here? Many of the Germanic tribes, French tribes were more nomadic, less imperial. Maybe they were more peace-loving. Maybe they were more spiritual. Maybe they lived in nature more humbly, yet they were called the barbarians. So you got to watch out for these biases. How about IQ tests? Are people with low IQ who score low on the test, are they actually less intelligent? If you adopt the modernist paradigm of science and rationality, you would say, yeah, they scored low on the IQ test. They are objectively low IQ and therefore low intelligence. But of course, if you start to think really deeply about what the IQ test is measuring and how it really works, first of all, you might identify that there are biases in IQ tests. Western biases, perhaps white biases, perhaps male biases, whatever. IQ tests could be biased towards people with certain kinds of memory, certain kinds of visual thinking capacities, certain kinds of verbal intelligence, but intelligence can be multifaceted and very complex. And just because you score low on an IQ test doesn't mean that you're not intelligent. And yet, when you're adopting this sort of like strictly scientific model, you can literally scientifically tell people that they're stupid when they really aren't. And this harms people, right? This marginalizes people. What if somebody is born who's neurodivergent, autistic or whatever, and scores low on intelligence tests, but has a remarkable ability, you know, some sort of like savant abilities. And yet science tells him that he's stupid and he's not going to be able to contribute to scientific fields, or he's not going to be able to be a good intellectual or a good philosopher. See how this... So postmodernism points to these kinds of gaps in the modernist approach to things. How about this consideration? Is everything that can be empirically proven, formalized, and quantified, is everything that cannot be empirically proven, formalized, and quantified, is it all untrue? In other words, to what extent can things exist that are true out there, but that we cannot formalize or quantify? See, the rigid modernist paradigm says that if it's not provable, quantifiable, verifiable, formalizable, then we shouldn't even think about it. It's just pseudoscience and hogwash. But is that really true? Postmodernism says, no, that's just your narrow paradigm. There's much more to reality beyond that that's being missed. How about this question? Are emotions less real than scientific facts? Who's to say that we should put scientific facts above emotions? You see how that's a bias. That biases can be at an individual level, but also at a collective level. We can do that as a culture, as a society, as an institution. But what's being missed when you denigrate and marginalize the emotional? How about this issue? Is it right that the U.S. tries to maintain Western liberal hegemony, a sort of a Western global order of human rights and individualism? Is it right for America to impose that everywhere around the world? Well, what Alexander Dugin was saying is that it's not right, and that in fact this is racism. It's racist to do that. One of Dugin's biggest gripes about the West is that the West just has this infatuation with individualism. And Dugin says that, for example, for Russia to be its healthiest form as a state, it needs to prioritize collectivism over the individual. And that when you prioritize individualism, what that ends up with is narcissism, egotism, and all of the other social problems that come from that. And who's to say that Dugin is wrong? See, if you're a libertarian, has it even occurred to you to question whether the individualism that you take as an absolute good could actually be creating most of the harms in society that you are railing against? See? Most libertarians have never even considered this. Postmodernism helps with that, because postmodernism opens the mind to looking at the world from multiple different points of view, and then you might read some Dugin, whereas ordinarily you would just dismiss Dugin. Here, with postmodernism, you might read some Dugin and you might say, yeah, who's to say he's not right? Maybe we should be open to that perspective. That's one perspective. Maybe I'm a libertarian, but that's just one perspective. And that is the key. That's the key difference, because the difference is you can be a libertarian, but in different ways. You can be a libertarian who's just locked into the paradigm of libertarianism and knows nothing else and can never break free of it. Or you can be the kind of libertarian who says, yeah, I'm a libertarian in a kind of a loose way. But it's not a grand narrative, though. My libertarianism is just like a micro narrative, and I'm open to other ideas. And by being open to other ideas, eventually what will happen is that you'll outgrow your libertarianism because you'll find better ideas out there. But you would never have found them if you were just locked into a modernist paradigm, which held that libertarianism and individualism and the non-aggression principle, that this is the absolute good and the absolute truth and a universal value for everybody. Maybe it isn't. How about this question? Is it true that democracy is the best for every culture and civilization? Dugan would argue it isn't. Democracy is right for certain civilizations and cultures and not right for others. And look, again, we saw this play out very clearly in Afghanistan and in Iraq as Americans. America invaded Afghanistan, invaded Iraq, was there for a decade or more, almost 2 decades in Afghanistan. And what did we accomplish? Were we able to liberate them and impose our democracy on them? No. Does that mean that there's sort of 2 ways we can look at that? Is we could say, well, maybe that's just because we didn't try hard enough. We should have tried harder, bombed them a little bit more, stayed a little bit longer, and then it would have worked. Or maybe it's because different cultures require different things relative to their level of development. Maybe it's that. And see, the whole project of, the Bush invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, this whole project was a modernist project. And when they sold it to the American people, they sold it as factual, objective, right? There's weapons of mass destruction. We know this for a fact. And democracy is the best. Human rights are the best. We know this for a fact. And that's why they're going to treat us as liberators, and they're going to be happy, and they're going to soak up this democracy like a sponge, and then it's going to feel natural to them, and it's just going to work out, and women will be free. We will liberate the women, and the gay rights gays will no longer be killed, and their society will finally flourish and be secular, and technology and capitalism will flourish. So the arrogance and the narcissism of the Bush administration is to have that kind of worldview, which then leads to that kind of action where you're imposing that on everybody else. This is what Dugan is criticizing, the kind of racism and arrogance that is. This is the sort of hidden sort of racism. He calls it racism. It's really more just like a, not racism, but we could call it's kind of a chauvinism. When you're so self-absorbed that you can't see that you're pushing your agenda on somebody else. There's something deeply wrong and unconscious about that. Not just at a collective level, but at an individual level. If you treat your children in this kind of chauvinistic way, where you think that what you believe is right for your children is what they should be doing, like you believe your child should be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer, and you push your child into that, but your child was born with an artistic mind. He doesn't have a mind for engineering or lawyering or doctoring. He needs to be an artist. But you just push him more to be a lawyer. He becomes a lawyer and then he kills himself. See, this is the real world consequences of this kind of rigid modernist ideology. How about this question? Is technological progress and technocracy really an objective good? In the West, we treat it that way. All this stuff happening with AI, social media, virtual reality, robotics, electric cars, all this stuff. Is this really making people happier? Is the quality of life of people in America improving? Is Gen Z better off than Gen X and millennials and boomers? It's not so obvious. You can see in a certain sense that a lot of these are just like myths that we have, biases, deep cultural biases. A lot of this stuff is culturally constructed. The idea that we're going to reach the technological singularity in the next 20 years with AI, and we're going to be in some sort of, we're going to be better off for this. See, this is what Dugan questions. Dugin is very much opposed to this. He thinks that all of this is the work of Satan. All this AI stuff, Satanism. That's Dugin's perspective. Now, I'm not saying he's right, but the ability for you to consider these as different micro-narratives, that's a powerful thing, is what I'm trying to get you to see. Even the idea that life today is better than it was in the Middle Ages, you can make the case that for a lot of people it isn't. Sure, we have air conditioning and we have modern medicine and we don't have the Black Plague anymore and we don't have feudalism. But in a certain sense, if you were just an ordinary person, an ordinary peasant with your wife and family and kids living on a farm somewhere in the Middle Ages, yeah, it was hard work, but it was satisfying in a certain sense. You worshiped God. You were a God-fearing Christian, and your life was kind of peaceful. You ate organic food. You had a big family of 8 children. There was happy times. They helped you on the farm. And what are you doing now? What are you doing now? You're sitting around jerking off to AI porn, AI tentacle porn, playing video games, drinking Mountain Dew and eating beef jerky. And what is that really better? Are you really more evolved? That medieval peasant, he could have even had some enlightenment experiences. But not you, because you're sitting there addicted to the internet. You're never going to have an enlightenment experience in your life, thanks to that. You're never going to get married. You can barely get laid. You're frustrated. Your brain is brainwashed. Yeah, you're not brainwashed with Christianity. Instead, you're brainwashed by Andrew Tate and by Flat Earth and by anti-vaxxers and by libertarianism and by whatever the crazy garbage you find online. How about this? Is there really one right way to do science? That's not so obvious. Is formal logical thinking really superior to feeling and intuition? That's not so obvious. Is scientific materialism and atheism really superior to the yogic worldview from 5,000 years ago? That's not so obvious. Could science have a masculine bias to it, given that science is so rational, so logical, so formal? Is there something science is missing because of that? How about this one? If you're like in that sort of modernist objective morality camp like Sam Harris, it's very funny when people like Sam Harris want to claim that they're very scientific, but then any scientific person who has a morality is deeply unscientific. Because is it really scientific or rational to claim that something like genocide is objectively evil? If you were truly scientific, you would say that nothing is more evil than anything else. Because science doesn't say that genocide is evil. Now, Sam Harris might say, well, yeah, Leo, science can't say that genocide is evil, but science can say that genocide causes a lot of suffering and societal instability, and therefore that's why genocide is wrong, scientifically wrong. But no, science doesn't say that at all. Sure, you can do some science on genocide and say that it causes suffering. You can do some brain scans and see that it causes suffering to people, but there's nothing, you can't jump from that to saying that genocide is wrong. There's no right or wrong according to science if you're doing proper science. Right? So part of the problem here is that the pre-modern worldview and the modern worldview will contain internal contradictions. It must. It's just a question of whether you see them or not. Someone like Sam Harris doesn't really see them. Postmodernism also has internal contradictions, but you have to be careful because anyone who wants to demonize any of these worldviews can easily do so by pointing out internal contradictions. You can easily demonize postmodernism by pointing out a few internal contradictions. But you can do that with modernism as well, right? So you have to be very careful about not cherry picking and not being biased here. So the value of postmodernism is that it can help you to see the internal contradictions of modernism, which otherwise are quite difficult to see. That doesn't mean postmodernism doesn't have its own internal contradictions, which are even harder, perhaps, to see. It depends. Some of them are harder, some of them are easier. There's definitely some like very obvious problems with the performative contradiction of postmodernism. We'll get to that in part 2. But yeah, you can. There's internal contradictions in postmodernism. You have to see through those and go beyond postmodernism. We'll work towards that. So don't get too hung up on internal contradictions so easily. It can be a red herring. What about race? Is race an objective scientific thing? How about in the past when the Irish and the Italians were considered non-white in America? That was the case a few hundred years ago. The Irish and the Italians were not considered white. Today they are. So to what degree is race a social construct? And see, race is very sneaky because a lot of sort of like race realists and people who want to use science and kind of mix it together with race, the whole thing is absurd because you can tell that the only reason these people care about science at all in this context is because they want to use it to justify some sort of deep-seated political bias that they have. They are white, and they believe whites should dominate. They're white supremacists. They're not neo-Nazis, whatever they are. And then they're going to try to use science or whatever other scheme, mysticism, anything. They'll use anything to rationalize why certain groups of people are a different race. And of course, they're not just doing a neutral scientific classification when they do that. When they do that, they're of course marginalizing certain groups that are not their own. So it's just really an exercise of selfishness. And postmodernism can point some of this stuff out to us and help us to undo some of this stuff. That's why a postmodernist might talk about white supremacy. And then to a modernist, it's like, dude, why are you so obsessed with race? It's not per se that we're so obsessed with race as postmodernists. It's just that we're interested in seeing how this kind of like sneaky manipulation is happening within the culture, the way culture is constructed. Of course, the problem is that many modernists, but especially pre-modernists, do not want to question their culture. They want to blindly preserve culture, which is what a lot of conservatives want to do, which is why they have made an arch enemy out of postmodernism. Because postmodernism, in a sense, is just really a deep skepticism of culture. Like, let's really question how we constructed culture, and then we'll see that we didn't just construct it. We constructed it in a biased, selfish way. The ego, of course, is always doing that. And then maybe if we do that, that will help us to loosen up culture, break up some of the structures, some of the inequities and injustices and hierarchies, and then that will free us up to create a better society, a more free, more pluralistic, ultimately more loving society, more open. But of course, that's exactly what the conservative mind does not want. And so therefore, it's not going to go into great depth understanding the complexities of postmodernism. Instead, what it's going to do is it's just going to look for cheap gotchas, ways to ridicule, to act outraged, to get emotional and all this sort of stuff, but never getting to the core insights, right? So I was giving you profound core insights that are really beyond and independent of postmodernism. So even though I presented postmodernism here as some sort of like monolithic singular thing, what we're going to be doing later in part 2 and maybe part 3 of this series is we're going to be disaggregating the core insights of postmodernism out of this structure, because ultimately my objective here is not to turn you into a postmodernist. That would be a mistake. It's not to get you to buy into a whole smorgasbord of bullet points. It's to have you. We have this cultural phenomenon called postmodernism, But again, because it's cultural, there's a lot of human bullshit in all of these paradigms. So ultimately, to transcend all this and to really get far, what we're going to have to do is we're going to take we're going to break them point by point. We're going to break them out from this larger structure of postmodernism. We're going to assess every single point individually and try to get your mind to have insight, direct insight into the truths of some of these points of postmodernism. And then based on that, your mind is going to develop and ultimately outgrow postmodernism. And then we're going to leave behind all those points that are false or limited. How about the issue of, does life really have an objective purpose or meaning? And then this one, this will be the last example here, is consider cats. Cats, what are cats? Cats is a category. It's a linguistic category. It's a duality. It's not a duality between cats and dogs. Don't get that wrong. It's a duality between cats and non-cats. It's a little counterintuitive there. So there's cats and non-cats. So cats exist for humans, but do cats exist for cats? This is an exercise a little homework assignment I'd like you to think about. Contemplate this. Does a cat know cats? Pause and really think about that. Don't dismiss this as something obvious, because it seems a little too silly and obvious at first. But really think about it. Does a cat know cats? Or is that something humans know? Of course, I'm not saying that a cat doesn't interact with other cats. That's not the issue. The issue is, does a cat know cats the way that you understand cats? So postmodernism helps you to see that something like a cat is a lot trickier than we thought in the modern and the pre-modern paradigms. Because there we took cats for granted. Cats, Leo, cats are just scientific facts. Cats existed in the world. They're objectively true. And of course, cats know about cats. Of course, a cat doesn't have the word cat in its head. Of course, it doesn't call it that. The word cat is just some arbitrary label we invented. We could have called it anything else. And a cat doesn't really talk to itself in its head. But a cat still knows cats, and a cat is just doing cat stuff, and it's all so obvious. And postmodernism says, no, it's not that obvious. And this helps open your mind to much more advanced truths that we'll ultimately want to have you work towards. And actually, there's one mega example that I want to bring in here to help demonstrate this point, which is the distinction between madness and rationality. So under the modernist paradigm, being rational is good, being mad is bad. Madness is badness. And so how does the modernist paradigm justify this? Let's take a look. And then how do we transcend this kind of duality, this dualistic thinking? If you start to look at what rationality really is, and more to the point, rationalism. Rationalism is, the difference between rationality and rationalism is that rationalism is a sort of a turning of rationality into a whole worldview, and then turning that into a totalistic system for making sense of reality, and then dismissing anything outside of it. Sort of like scientism does with science. So if you look at what rationalism is, what you start to see is that the principles and axioms of rationality cannot themselves be grounded in reason. And every rational process requires certain axioms. You even need axioms to buy into the idea that reason can make sense of reality. That itself is not a given. You have to take that on as an axiom. But according to rationalism, one of the things rationalism does, and what makes it rational is an ism, is that it believes that everything should be able to be grounded in reason and logic. And if it isn't, then it's invalid and it's untrue, which is why madness is bad and rationality is good. But according to this, if we kind of deconstruct this, what we can see is that, well, if rationalism says that everything needs to be grounded in logical proofs and well-justified beliefs, well, but rationality itself and the operation of rationalism and the idea that you can apply rationalism to understand all of reality, that itself is not a consequence of any kind of reasoning process. It's assumed. It has to be. It's axiomatic. But if that's the case, how can you claim that rationality is superior to madness? So when you investigate this, what you realize is that rationality comes with an unjustified bias behind it. And it makes appeals to survival and pragmatism. You could say, well, Leo, if you're operating irrationally and you're in madness, you can't even survive. You can't run a business. You can't do science. You can't do any of these things. So therefore, rationalism must be the best. It must be true. We must accept it. And if you don't, you're being irrational. Well, of course, that begs the question, but this kind of appeal to pragmatism and survival and utility, there's nothing rational about you having to survive or you being able to run a business. You see, that's not rational. It's not rational to claim that because I'm surviving and I'm running a business and I'm able to do science, because of that, that means rationalism is the ultimate total true system for understanding reality. That doesn't follow. That's not rational to say that. There's no logical deduction for that, you see. So rationalism ends up, through self-reflectivity, ends up undermining itself and eating its own tail. You can't make appeals to survival to justify your rationality because, after all, who's to say that it's rational to be alive? Maybe the wise thing is to kill yourself. Who's to say? Or maybe madness is a better alternative for dealing with life than rationality. How could that be? Well, what if I want to be a raving madman sitting on the corner of the street? You might say, well, Leo, that's an objectively bad life. According to your biases and standards. That's not a universal, right? You're applying your certain preferential value system. What if I just want to be completely free? What if I want my mind to be free? Free of science, free of business, free of rationality, literally, and just be a mad, disheveled homeless man sitting on the street. Who are you to say that that's wrong? Now, at this point, most people will say, well, Leo, this is just preposterous. But here I would say the only reason you say it's preposterous is because of your culture. Your culture has enculturated you to such a degree that you think that going to a cubicle like a good little, worker bee every single day and sitting at a computer for 10 hours a day, punching in and doing your stupid spreadsheets, doing that for 60 years, and you're telling yourself that this is what counts as a good life. And you say that that is rational. And you say that sitting on the corner as a stark raving madman, that is irrational, that is somehow inferior. And so what you need to realize is that what you're engaging in here is you're not really being logical or rational. You're actually just turning all of your biases and preferences, and you're rationalizing them, and you're turning to this thing called rationalism. And you're not appreciating things such as, for example, maybe madness can have its advantages. Maybe madness allows you to become conscious of things that you never would have been conscious of had you just been working in your cubicle, doing your modernist crap. Maybe madness is not what you think it is. See, you have preconceived ideas of what madness is. And these are not just preconceived ideas, they come with stigma. It's bad, it's unhealthy, it will destroy society, it will make me unhappy, and all these other things. But maybe what will make you most unhappy is being highly rational. Maybe that madman, sure, he's not rich, he doesn't have a fancy car and a fancy house, but maybe he's free and he can just socialize and he's a free spirit and he could even have enlightenment experiences and he can be spiritual sitting on that street corner and he can be happier than you could ever imagine. And you'd never even know it because of your modernist biases. And all of this was just this skewed dichotomy that you created, but not really you, your culture, because you don't think at all. You just do what your culture tells you. You're not that smart. If you're a rationalist, you're not smart. Your rationalism was just indoctrinated into you. You didn't actually come up with it. And so your culture told you that rationality is superior to irrationality and created this false dichotomy, and you just accepted it. You never even questioned it. And here comes postmodernism to tell you that maybe you should loosen up and rethink your starting positions. And if you really want to understand what I said here, it might sound a bit like I'm being kind of melodramatic and kind of preposterous. Like, Leah, why did you pick this example? It's not a kind of like an obvious example where it's clear that shouldn't you have picked an example where it was something where like it was obvious that the inferior thing is at least on par with the supposedly superior thing? Because here I can't even see how madness could possibly ever rise, never mind rise above, but even rise to the level of rationality. Well, what I would tell you there is, if you really want to understand what I said here, because I said something super advanced that 99% of people will never understand, is if you really want to understand this and you really want to understand what postmodernism is pointing you towards that you're missing, smoke some salvia or some DMT, and you will understand. You'll get a little glimpse. You'll get a little glimpse of what postmodernism was pointing to, what you're missing. Because see, as a modernist, as a modernist critic of what I'm saying, you're going to say, Leo, yeah, you're talking about all this philosophy and it's so like lofty, these lofty ideas. But in the end, how is this going to change my life? And the modernist will ultimately say, Leo, what am I missing? Like postmodernism, you're acting as though postmodernism is pointing to these truths that I'm missing somehow. But I don't see that I'm missing anything. Like, I don't see how my life would ever change from these ideas. Well, yeah, because the things that are being pointed to are so deep that it'll take you 10 years to understand this episode. And you don't even understand what you don't understand. So what could speed that along is some salvia or some DMT. Do some salvia, some DMT. You will quickly see some of the things you've been missing that postmodernism was trying to open your mind to, but you were close to. But of course, that's still very conditional because that assumes that you're going to actually be open-minded enough to even like really accept what smoking some salvia or some DMT would show you, because that's going to be so difficult for you. As a modernist, salvia and DMT will obliterate modernism. Just obliterate it. Obliterate it. Now, there's two things you can do with that. You can accept it, struggle through it and accept it, and then your mind is opened, and then you see something beyond modernism. Or you can just be so stubborn and pig-headed that you say, no, modernism has to be true, and then what you're going to do is you're going to say, well, yeah, salvia and DMT, that was just some sort of crazy hallucination, and it was dangerous, and Leo, you gave me some bad advice to take this stuff, it's unhealthy, and it doesn't prove anything. Leo, it doesn't prove anything. It's just all a hallucination in the brain. It proves nothing. You could take that approach too. By the way, I'm not telling you to do salvia or DMT. These are extremely dangerous chemicals. They will completely melt your mind and could be physically dangerous. You could kill yourself. So by no means am I saying you should do this. I'm just saying, because look, as a modernist, I know you're going to want to know what are the consequences. Where are the tangible consequences? So I'm giving you the tangible consequences, but I'm warning you that the tangible consequences of the things that I'm pointing to are so radical that you could have a psychotic break. That's what I'm pointing to. Now you're going to say, well, Leo, if that's true, then why would I want a psychotic break? Doesn't that prove that rationality is superior? And no, it doesn't prove that at all. You don't know what a psychotic break will do for you. Could be good, could be bad for you. See, again, don't judge psychotic break as something bad. You don't know. Have you experienced a psychotic break? So then why are you judging it? That's just part of the same modernist, biases that we've already been questioning here. Okay, now to start to wrap this up, let's talk about some of the right-wing reactions to postmodernism, which is seen all through social media. The right wing strawmans postmodernism because it doesn't understand it, fundamentally. The right is not post-rational. At best, right-wingers are rational. A lot of them are pre-rational. Jordan Peterson is especially guilty of this, of poisoning the well, as we might say. Jordan Peterson talks about postmodernism a lot, and then a lot of other right-wingers in the right-wing ecosystem, they just regurgitate and parrot his slanders against postmodernism. This phrase, postmodern neo-Marxist. Anyone who is parroting this phrase on the right is only parroting it because Jordan Peterson has indoctrinated people into using this phrase. It's a thought-terminating cliche, and it's a smear. Because what's happening is that as Jordan Peterson speaks about this stuff, he speaks about it from a very emotionally loaded point of view. He's not explaining to his audience. He has a huge audience. A lot of them are not very well informed. They're very biased towards his position because of the alignment on Christianity and certain conservative values, traditional values, anti-trans, all this kind of stuff. So just because they're aligned with him on that stuff, anything he says, they're going to instinctively adopt as truth, and they're going to adopt even his emotional positions and reactions and judgments. They're going to adopt that as well because it's part of his sort of like cohesive worldview, his paradigm. They're going to just buy into that whole paradigm. And they're not going to think very critically about what is even meant by postmodern neo-Marxist. Because postmodernism is a very complex thing to explain, and I guarantee you that no person who says postmodern neo-Marxist is ever going to be able to actually explain what postmodernism is. What they will offer you is a straw man of it that they learned from some right-wing source who itself never understood, because Jordan Peterson doesn't really understand postmodernism. The core insights of relativity, social construction, other things like this, it's just obvious that he doesn't have a grasp of these things, which is not to say that everything he says is wrong. But the problem I have with what he's doing is he's doing a moral condemnation of postmodernism as an intellectual scheme to people who have no idea what it is. That's very different than if he, for example, explained, not as a straw man, but actually explained in great detail what postmodernism is and the profound insights that it offers. Not necessarily to say that postmodernism is true, but just to present it here the way I'm presenting it so that people, his audience, has the full facts and information. And then if he wanted to condemn it or to judge it or to demonize it, then he could, rip into it and do a critique, which I'm going to do in later parts of this series. So stay tuned for that. Don't worry. We're gonna do a lot of criticism of postmodernism. But see, before you can do that, to be intellectually honest, first you have to give a steel man of the postmodern position, which is what I've been doing for the last 3 hours. First, you got to do that, which of course Jordan Peterson hasn't done, and the reason he hasn't done it is because he can't do it because he doesn't understand it. So it's coming fundamentally from a position of ignorance. And so this ignorance is being spread like a virus through the entire right-wing ecosystem. This is a deep regret of mine. Very concerning to me. I don't like this. So part of my work here is to undo that damage. Jordan Peterson has done a lot of harm to his fan base by prejudicing them against postmodernism. See, it's hard for me to even talk about this topic because I know that many people watching will just have been indoctrinated by the moral condemnation that Peterson and the right have already done on this topic. So I have to already I've spent hours preempting this stuff and being very thoughtful about how to introduce this stuff and it's going to be very difficult to undo all that damage. And the biggest shame of it all is that Jordan Peterson's fan base is completely unaware of the core insights of postmodernism and their importance. And this makes them stuck in a pre-rational, or at best a rational stage of cognitive development, stuck in spiral dynamic stage blue and orange, developing a stage green shadow, which is what Jordan Peterson is infecting them with, because he hasn't worked out his own stage green shadow. So the first thing I want to tell you is be very careful calling postmodernism woke or wokeness, conflating these two things. As soon as you say wokeness, you've already lost the plot. Because wokeness, again, is one of these right-wing, phrases of demonization. It has so much political baggage. When you use these phrases, wokeness, postmodern, neo-Marxist, you miss all of the profound insights that we've been discussing. And don't worry, just because you're able to do a nice steel man of postmodernism doesn't mean you have to accept it, right? I'm not trying to indoctrinate you with anything, but just understand the difference between truly grasping a worldview versus just listening to somebody condemning it, which is what Jordan Peterson does. Here are some examples of how postmodernism is strawmanned on the right. Postmodernism is equated with Marxism and communism. There are some deep problems with that at the level of philosophy. Postmodernism is identified with identity politics, equality of outcome, social justice warriors, the progressive left, feminism, LGBTQ, CRT, DEI, and trans. A lot of this buzzword stuff is going on. All of these buzzwords prevent a real contact of your mind with insights and with reality. This whole thing of, what is a woman? That's popular on the right. This question of what is a woman? Again, these kinds of questions aren't really being used to understand anything. They're being used just to ridicule, to mock, and to be defensive, to be emotionally reactive, to try to do a gotcha on somebody, to make them look bad. Equating postmodernism with pedophilia or with grooming kids. This is very popular on the right. Again, this is just a demonization, just a way of avoiding doing the real philosophy. Or postmodernism as equating it as being irrational, degenerate, or destroying the West. This is also a straw man and a demonization. If you demonize postmodernism, you will miss the core insights and fail to develop into the post-rational stage of cognitive development. You will get lost in a stage green shadow, a postmodernist shadow, and you'll get distracted in the shallow culture wars. This would be a shame. I want you to beware if you're consuming a lot of political content or this kind of culture war content on social media. Just beware that political culture warriors such as Jordan Peterson will try to hijack your mind with this topic. And these people don't care about your cognitive development. They don't even understand what cognitive development is. They are busy building their own media careers and exploiting your attention for clicks. These people are ideologues. They're not serious philosophers. They don't have a serious grasp of philosophy, of consciousness, of reality, of human psychology. Even though Peterson, acts like a psychologist, and he is one, but that doesn't mean he's really communicating to you a deep understanding of human psychology. In fact, he's very sneakily programming you with various biases of his own, right? I'm not saying he's doing this maliciously. He thinks he's doing what's best for society, but he will not help you to reach post-rational stages of cognitive development. I promise you that. So one exercise I have for you is that as you're engaging with all the things that I said here and you're really deeply contemplating it, I want you in your mind to first start by creating a steel man of postmodernism. How can you frame postmodernism in your mind such that it is not ridiculous, it doesn't sound stupid, it doesn't sound evil or degenerate, or that it's going to lead to the destruction of society or other awful things like this? So first do that, and then we'll critique it. Don't worry. We'll point all the limitations of it, which we'll do in part 2 and probably part 3 of this series. We're probably going to need 3 parts here. Let me say a few points about why postmodernism infuriates conservatives so much, because you could see that they get emotionally reactive to it. You could see, like, Jordan Peterson, just notice, if you're wondering, like, well, Leo, how do I know whether what you're saying is true or whether Jordan Peterson is saying is true about postmodernism? Isn't it like a he said, she said kind of situation? And after all, Leo, doesn't postmodernism say that all perspectives are equally valid? So who are you to say that he's wrong? Well, first of all, understand that I'm not a postmodernist. So I'm not limited by postmodernist, ideas of right and wrong being completely subjective. Second of all, the way you can tell is just by you can see Jordan Peterson gets angry, furious, morally outraged. Like, he starts acting out. His ego clearly starts acting out because he's talking about his own shadow when he talks about postmodern neo-Marxism. You can see this. And if you try to engage with him in a real substantive discussion of these points, he wouldn't be able to do that. That's why I claim the things that I'm saying are beyond what he's teaching you. But anyways, and here's why. Here's why he has that shadow and why he gets so triggered by it. All conservatives do, because postmodernism is about questioning the status quo. If you're a conservative, your whole life mission is to defend the status quo, to obey the status quo. You don't want to question it. You don't want to deconstruct it. See, tradition represents a single dominant perspective, culture, or paradigm, which is what conservatives want to defend. Conservatives are bought into one grand meta-narrative of one form or another. It could be science, it could be religion, it could be a blending of both. Conservatives are usually bought into a single value system and a morality. They want to hold this morality as objective, given by God or some such thing. And this is the primary mental attachment, and it's fused with their identity and ego, such that when you're talking to Jordan Peterson about this topic, his ego, his identity, his Christianity, his identity as a scientist, all of that is blended together. And then postmodernism is like a solvent, a universal solvent that would dissolve this entire mental structure and apparatus. And that is fundamentally what he's terrified of and what he's defensive against, and that's what his crusade is against, is all of that. The conservative mind hates relativity and ambiguity. It's aggressively stuck defending duality. The conservative wants their culture and tradition to be special, unique, the best, objective, absolute, God-given, unquestionable. Conservatives don't want to admit that morality is relative or constructed. Conservatives don't want to investigate that. Conservatives don't want to be skeptical about their deepest held convictions because it's part of their identity. If they're skeptical about that, they lose their identity. They lose their life. Their whole life will fall apart. Conservatives want to maintain the dominant power structure and hierarchy because they benefit from it. That's what the status quo represents. What is the status quo? It's a certain religion, it's capitalism, it's patriarchy, it's ethnic supremacy of one form or another. Some ethnic group is in charge. It's your tribe. The tribe that's in charge wants to stay in charge, of course, of course. And then to question all that is to to necessarily deconstruct it and ultimately destroy it. And that's what conservatives cannot stomach. So, of course, postmodernism is the ultimate evil from a conservative's point of view. The more conservative they are, the more evil it is. Ultimately, conservatives want ethnic supremacy and purity. Conservatives don't want to deconstruct culture. They're busy fighting to preserve culture. And look, I'm not saying that conservatives are all wrong here. There can be very legitimate reasons for wanting to maintain the status quo because you are legitimately terrified of what would happen if we dissolve all of it and question all of it to death. You know, if you question capitalism, maybe you'll get communism. If you question science, maybe you'll get, pseudoscience instead. If you question religion, maybe you'll get immorality and atheism. Totally makes sense. I'm not saying there's not dangers to postmodernism, but also you have to distinguish here between truth and pure understanding versus survival. I'm very careful to distinguish these, and one of the hallmarks of my work is that I really am good at distinguishing these two things. I don't allow survival concerns to infect my philosophy. That's the only value that my philosophy really has, is that I'm able to separate those two things really well, whereas almost nobody else is. And so, Jordan Peterson goes so far as to conflate truth with survival. This is the fundamental error of this whole worldview. Truth, you have to separate truth away from survival if you want to do any kind of good sense making. So the reason, look, but yeah, that means that truth seeking and sense making does impact and diminish your capacity for survival. That's true, right? But that's a risk I'm willing to take with this work. Whether you want to take that risk, that's up to you, But if you really value truth, this is how you got to do it. So the right-wing response to postmodernism, hold on, before I say, one more question. There's a point that was slipping my mind. Maybe it'll come back. Okay, so the right-wing response to postmodernism is wrong because it comes from closed-mindedness, lack of understanding, lack of education, ideology, emotional reactivity, and groupthink. It's coming from below, not above. It's pre-rational, it's rational, it's not post-rational. I have no problem with criticizing the postmodern. There are definitely problems with the postmodern. We'll get to those in part 2. But before you can get to those, it's important that you're not doing it from below, right? You need to go from pre-rational to rational, go into post-rational, explore the post-rational, then transcend the post-rational, transcend postmodernism, and then looking downward, then that's where you criticize it from, which is what I'll be doing for you. And I'll be helping you to do that. Otherwise, if you don't do that, then you're going to be lost in critiques from below. It'll be like criticizing science while you're a creationist. It doesn't work. If you want to do a solid criticism of science, I've done that. You can watch my episode about science. I've done that. But in order to succeed in that properly, you need to, first of all, deconstruct creationism. Get over creationism, get out of Christianity, get into science, learn science, spend a decade learning science, then you can transcend science, and then you can criticize science from above, which is what I've done. Huge distinction there. So watch out for that green postmodernist shadow. That's what I'm trying to get you to avoid here. Or you're going to be acting out that shadow. What you see right-wingers doing on social media, in politics, on this issue, is they're acting out their stage green shadow. It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't move us forward. It certainly won't move your mind into higher stages of cognitive development, that kind of approach. All it's going to do is make you bitter and angry, combative, aggressive, like Jordan Peterson is. So now you're wondering, okay, so Leo, what's true? Is modernism more true or is postmodernism more true? Well, both capture important aspects of reality. It's a glass half full, glass half empty situation. There are important aspects of modernism which we're going to preserve. We're not going to throw all of it away. And there's important aspects of postmodernism that we're going to learn and we're going to keep with us for the rest of our lives. And then there's going to be stuff we're going to throw away. And so the trap here is trying to decide which one of them is wrong. None of them are wrong. And for that matter, those of you who are maybe in the pre-modern still, don't worry. Even when it comes to the pre-modern, there will be things in the pre-modern that we will preserve, or even in a more sophisticated way, what's going to really happen is that the things that you're worried about losing from the pre-modern, see, as a pre-modernist, you're really afraid of your God being destroyed by modernism and by postmodernism. With modernism, it's going to get destroyed by science and evolution. But you can kind of square that circle and you can kind of find a middle ground where you say that, yeah, evolution is true, science is true and valid, but God is still above and beyond all that. So you can find a synthesis and integrate those two. But then you're going to be left, so you're going to be kind of in the modernist frame, but then you're just still going to believe in God. But then there's going to be now you're going to be threatened by the postmodern, because postmodern is going to threaten to destroy all of that, science, rationality, evolution, and God, all of it. And then you're thinking to yourself, well, God damn, if that happens, I'm lost. I'm completely lost. I'm lost to Satanism or something, right? No. In the end, through this whole process, God will get you. Don't worry, you're not going to lose anything important in this process, I promise you. All we're doing through this whole process is we're just cutting the fat and burning off all the human bullshit, all the social constructions, everything. Don't worry, God is not a social construction, right? So you don't have to worry that God will get destroyed by postmodernism. It won't. Anything true will get preserved through this whole process. So just keep the faith. You need much more faith than Christianity has taught you. Okay, that's it for part one. There's going to be more parts. So first, before I go, just let me remind you real quick. I post a lot of amazing, important insights and resources on my blog. Go check that out. It's free. I'm posting almost on a daily basis, weekly for sure. Tons of stuff. I'll be posting a lot of examples of postmodernism on my blog, which will help you. These examples will help you to understand all this theory. Check out my life purpose course. It'll help you get a sense of direction in your life. Check out my website, Actualized.org. Check out my book list. I have a list of 200 book reviews of some of the best books that I've read on there, and I'll be adding more to those books in the future. Every time I add more books, it's free. It's a free update. And if you'd like, you can support me on Patreon. I appreciate that. All right. And the final thing I'll say is this. Even though we're talking about kind of academic sounding philosophy here, postmodernism, who in the real world even cares about this term? Nobody really, unless you're, some right-winger who's ranting against SJWs. No one really cares. But for whatever reason, you stumbled upon this episode, and this is your great fortune, because this episode will lead you, if you're open and you do the work, and it will take work, but if you do that, it will lead you to something called post-rational and meta-rationality, and even beyond. New stages of cognitive development that most of mankind doesn't even know exist. This is one of my top passions in life, is teaching you how to reach these higher stages of cognitive development. In fact, I'm sort of reorienting all of Actualized.org to do that. I've been thinking about, what is it that I really teach here? Spirituality, self-help, blah, blah, blah. That's how I've done it in the past, but really, I'm narrowing my focus and my niche, and what I've realized just recently, because I've had new breakthrough insights into meta-rationality and how cognitive development works. I've had such a profound understanding of construct awareness and what that really means that nobody really understands, and I'm going to be explaining all that in episodes to come in this series, and it's going to take more than just this series to do that. So stay tuned for all that. But I'm changing the focus of Actualized.org to to teach people the highest stages of cognitive development, which almost no spiritual teacher is doing. So that's a huge shift that I'm making. It's not about enlightenment or awakening. I'm going to be teaching you crazy advanced cognitive development stages. So that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm really excited about that. There's going to be like deep, juicy content coming up. And you, if you're new to this work and you just stumbled upon this series, this episode, this is serendipity for you. Serendipity. This will change your whole life if you actually follow through with like the next 10 or 20 episodes that I release. It's just going to be life-changing. A whole new door will open, new dimensions to realities that you couldn't imagine. So, and all of that is being just opened with the doorway of postmodernism. So this whole topic, I'm being a little sneaky on you. Even though we're talking about postmodernism, it's really about something way beyond postmodernism. But since postmodernism is what people are talking about these days, this is a good entry point. All right, so make sure you stay tuned for part 2 and all the parts to come.